And I want to go back. The first computers were large, expensive machines that had been built to do calculations. How did people think about this new technology?
Well, I think that some people thought they were never going to get any smaller. There were calculations about how many Empire State Buildings you needed full of vacuum tubes to do this and that. And other people at Bell Labs who had been working on the transistor had a sense that this could be used as a switch because AT&T wanted something to replace vacuum tubes. And so I think there are several perceptions of how big the thing was going to be. I think it wasn't until the 60s that people started thinking that computers could get quite small.
So part of the problem was the size. The other problem was just what it was supposed to be for, this machine.
Yeah, I think that when they were doing ballistic calculations, there's this notion that you would run a program for a very long time. It was really after UNIVAC in the 1950s that people started thinking, we might have to do some programming. And people, most notably Grace Hopper, very early on started thinking about higher level programming languages. So that was sort of one flow. And I think the other thing was the urgency of the Cold War got people thinking about air defense. And so scientists at MIT started working on systems that could assess radar and show it to you on a display. And those are the first computers that had displays and pointing devices.
Now, for the most part, though, those were kind of exceptions. I mean, can you describe what the batch processing experience was like? I mean, what it would have been like?
Well, I've always thought of it as something like a factory. You have this very large thing, and there are raw ingredients going in the front, and there are some very complex processes that have to be coordinated. And then sometime later, you get what you were hoping for out of the rear end. And you could think of them also as like a railroad. Somebody else is deciding the schedules. I can certainly remember having maybe one run a day or two runs a day, and you could only get your results then, and you had to work around it and so forth. So it was very much of an institutional way of thinking about computing.
Did this put many people off computing?
I don't think so. I think the happiness is how much expectations, how much the reality exceeds expectations. I think that most people were happy. In the 50s, there are still, in business, predominantly business computing was done with punch card machines. And IBM was a company that made those punch card machines. So there's an enormous disparity between what you could do with computers and what most people did.
But still, for most people, the physical size and appearance of the machine was a compelling thing, and that gave mythology.
My feeling is that anything that's larger than human scale invokes mechanisms concerned with religion. So you have a priesthood with white coats. All the paraphernalia were there, and some people thought it would take over the world, and some people wanted it to take over the world, and some people were afraid it would take over the world, and none of those things happened. But that was what it was when it was this large thing. And towards the late 50s, many people in different places started saying, well, this thing has the potential of being more like a partner, maybe a complementary partner. It can do some things that we can't do well and vice versa, so we should find some way of bringing it down to human scale.
But a partner to the individual?
A partner to people, not so much directly connected to the institutions. Although, of course, the first way it was done using time sharing, the mainframe was still owned by the institution.
Okay, now, of the people, of these sort of very early visionaries, I mean, you've divided them into sort of two groups, haven't you? Could you talk a bit about that?
Which two groups?
Well, one group was the ones who were interested in amplifying intelligence. There
are lots of different groups.
I'll rephrase that. Okay, so turn over.
Okay, must be okay because we're still rolling, right? So, well, I think in the late 50s there were a variety of different conceptions of what you should do with it, and some of those conceptions are had by the very same person. So, for instance, John McCarthy, who is a professor at MIT, both wrote memos suggesting we should timeshare the computer, and he also thought more into the future, that we'd be all networked together and there would be these huge information utilities that would be like our power and lighting utilities that would give us the entire wealth of the knowledge of man. And he suggested on that what we'd have to have is something like an intelligent agent, an entity not maybe as smart as us, but an expert in finding things, and we would have to give it advice. He called it the advice taker.
Tell me a bit about time sharing, because obviously one thing people would say is, how could everybody have their own computer, wouldn't they? I mean, it's so
well, I think that was it. They cost several $1 million back then, and people had been fooling around with things a little bit like time sharing before sort of the official invention of it at MIT. And part of it was just to debug programs. The idea is that debugging is one of the most painful process. Incidentally, you probably know that there was actually a bug. The first bug was one found by, a moth, I think, found by Grace Hopper. So it actually has an official. And a friend of mine just recently was having trouble with his laser printer, and nothing that they thought of could possibly work. And finally somebody decided to open it up and look in it, and what it was a mouse. The mouse had moved in. It was nice and warm. It had, on top of the circuit board, had set up various places. You know, so it was like it was real. And of course, nobody understood what it meant when they said that this guy's computer has a mouse problem, because mice don't have problems. So, you know, it's an ill wind that blows nobody good.
Tell me about the basic concept of time sharing. What was the idea?
Well, the idea was that when humans use computers, the best way of having them use it is, instead of using all of the power for 5 minutes a day, is to take those 5 minutes of computer power and spread it out over several hours, because people are slow at typing, and when you're debugging, you don't need to do long runs of things, and what you want is lots of interaction, lots of finding out that you're wrong and this is wrong, and you can make a little change and this is wrong. So you want to go from something that requires enormous planning to something that's much more incremental. And this is the urge the people who developed time sharing had.
But how could you give an individual exclusive access to a computer?
Well, you couldn't. So the idea is, if the thing costs several $1 million, as McCarthy pointed out, one of the things that you could do is roll in one person's job and do it for a couple of seconds, then roll in another person's job and do it for a couple of seconds. And if you had a fast enough disk for holding all of these jobs, then you'd be able to handle 20, 30 or more people at once, and they wouldn't feel that the lag of a few seconds was going to
so
hurt
the
them.
computer's switching between the jobs so fast, is that the way it works? That
Right. Right. Well, that's the way it's supposed to work. And of course, the thing that drove personal computing in the 60s into existence was that it proved to be extremely difficult to get reliable response time.
But this is like one of the early ideas of the user having an illusion.
Yes, indeed.
Right, yeah.
Right. In fact, the best one of these was a system called JOS at RAND Corporation, in which the system was devoted entirely to running this single language. That made things much better. The language was designed for end users. It was the first thing that affected people the way spreadsheets do today. It was designed, had 8 users on this 1950s machine, but the guy who did it, Cliff Shaw, was a real artist. And the feeling of using this system was unlike that of using anything else on a computer. And people who used that system thought of wanting all of their computing to have the same kind of aesthetic, warm feeling that you had when using JOS.
Now, if you had to list, if you were, a very clear thinking person back then in the late 50s, who knew everything they wanted computing to be, what would they have? Would it have to be small, interactive, real time? What would be the...
Well, I think in the 50s, the emphasis, these things go in waves. So the emphasis in the 50s was first on being able to do things incrementally. Second, people wanted to share. So the idea of electronic mail was very early at MIT. And at some point, people started thinking that the form of interaction started to have a lot to do with how good you felt and how puzzled you were and so forth. The invention of computer graphics, modern computer graphics by Ivan Sutherland in 1962, had a lot to do with people's perceptions, because once you saw that, you couldn't go back. It established a whole new way of thinking about computer interaction, and to this day, it has remained an inspiration.
Tell me about that piece of work. He was a graduate student, wasn't he?
Yes, he had gone to Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon, and came to MIT to do his PhD work. One of his advisors was Claude Shannon, and another one was Marvin Minsky. And as he has told the story several times, is that they were then in just the early stages of Jack Licklider's dream to have the computer be a sort of a symbiotic partner. And when he went out to Lincoln Labs, people were starting to think about that. And there was a marvelous machine there called the TX2, which is one of the last computers in the U.S. large enough to have its own roof. You know, it was one of these enormous machines originally built for the air defense system. And Ivan made friends with people there and started thinking about something having to do with computer graphics. This, you know, the air defense system used displays for putting up radar plots and so forth. And the light guns were already around and so forth. And so he started thinking about maybe doing a drafting system. And as I recall it, one of his original reactions when seeing the kind of graphics you could put on a screen, because the screens couldn't even draw lines. When they put up a line, it was put up with lots of individual dots and done fairly slowly. So it would flicker, and it was pretty awful looking. And Ivan at that point said the best words a computer scientist can ever say, which is, what else can it do? And so he got, in fact, having the display not be great helped what he tried to do on it, because he started thinking of what was the actual power and value of the computer. Now today we have a problem because the displays are good, so our tendency is to simulate paper. But what Ivan started thinking about is what kind of value could the computer bring to the transaction so it would be even worthwhile to sit down and use such an awful looking display. And the thing he came out with was that the computer could help complete the drawings. So you could sketch, this is where the idea of Sketchpad, you could sketch something in. You could sketch in, if you're trying to make a flange, well, you just put in the lines for the flange, and then you would tell Sketchpad to make all of these angles right angles. And you could make these two things proportional to each other and so forth. And Sketchpad would solve the problem and straighten out the drawing in front of your eyes into something that was more like what you wanted. So that was a terrific idea. And then he took it another step further because he realized he could solve real-world problems. So if you put a bridge into Sketchpad, it had never been told about bridges before, but you could put bridges in and tell Sketchpad about pulling and pushing of things and hang a weight on the bridge, and Sketchpad would generate the stresses and strains on the bridge. So it was now acting as a simulation. You could put in an electric circuit. Sketchpad had never heard about electric circuits before, but you could put in Ohm's law and what batteries do, and it would, in order to settle the constraints, or one of the nicest things was you could put in mechanical linkages. So you could do something like a reciprocating arm, like on a locomotive wheel, for going from reciprocating to circular motion. And Sketchpad's problem solver, if it had a problem that it couldn't get an exact solution for, there wasn't just one solution, and of course there isn't for this, what it would do is iterate through all the solutions. So it would actually animate this thing, and right on the screen you'd see this thing animating. It was the very thing that you were thinking of.
This was very early. It sounds very
62, modern. Yeah. Well, you can't buy a system today that does all the things that Sketchpad could back then. That's what's really amazing. It had the first system that had a window, first system that had icons, certainly the first system to do all of its interaction through the display itself. And for a small number of people in this community, the Advanced Research Projects Agency research community, this system was like seeing a glimpse of heaven, because it had all of the kinds of things that the computers seemed to promise in the 50s. And practically everything that was done in the 60s in that community and into the 70s had this enormous shadow cast by Sketchpad that, or you could maybe think of it better as a light that was sort of showing us the way.
That's one glimpse of heaven. Another glimpse of heaven, I suppose, is the work of Doug Engelbart.
Yes, and he was also funded by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and his original proposal, I think, was also 1962. 1962 is one of those amazing years. And Engelbart had read about the MEMEX device that Vannevar Bush, who was President Roosevelt science advisor and former professor at MIT, he had written an article in 1945 called As We May Think, and most of the article was devoted to predictions of the future, and one of them was, he said, that sometime in the future we'll have in our home a thing like a desk, and inside the desk on optical storage will be the contents of a small town library, like 5,000 books. There'll be multiple screens, there'll be pointing devices and ways of getting information in and pointing to things that are there, and he said that you can form trails that would connect one piece of information to another. He invented a profession called pathfinding, that there would be people called pathfinders who sold paths. You could buy a path that would connect some set of interesting things to some other set of interesting things. And so this is a complete vision in 1945. And a lot of people read that. I read it in the 50s when I was a teenager because I had seen it referred to in a science fiction story. Engelbart had read it fairly early when he was in military service. And once you read that thing, you couldn't get it out of your mind, because it was the thing that anybody who deals with knowledge would desperately like to have. And so Engelbart, in the early 60s, started writing proposals, and he finally got ARPA interested in funding it, and they started building a proposal of his, and a couple of years later, in 1964, he invented the mouse to have both a better pointing device than the light pen and a cheaper one. And they built a system that by 1968 was able to give a very large-scale demonstration to 3,000 people in San Francisco.
And you were there?
I was there.
Tell me about.
Well, I had seen the system beforehand, because of course I was a graduate student in this community. But still, even having seen the system, the scale of the demo and the impact it had is unbelievable. I remember it started off, it was about 3,000 people in this auditorium. I was at the Fall Joint Computer Conference, I think, and all you could see on the stage was this figure with something in his lap and a box in front of him and a couple of things that looked like TV cameras around him. And he had on a headset, and he started talking. He said, "I'd like to welcome you to our demonstration." All of a sudden, his face appeared 20 by 30 feet wide on this enormous screen, because they borrowed one of the NASA, one of the first video projectors on this, and they used this huge situation display. And then they used video editing, so you could see while he was giving this demonstration what he was doing with his hands, with the mouse and the key set, what was going on the screen and so forth. And that is videotaped. I mean, that's something that you can use for your...
Yes, so you're talking about Doug. What did he demonstrate? What sort of things did he show?
Douglas Engelbart, he started off just showing us how you could point to things on the screen and indicate them, and started off actually fairly simply, just showing how you could look at information in various ways. He showed something very much like HyperCard. So he had a little map of how he was going to go home that night. He was going to go to the library and the grocery store and the drugstore and so forth. And he could click on each one of those things, and it would pop up and show him what he had to get there. And what he demonstrated were the early stages of what we call hypertext today. Uh, lots of response in the system. One of the big shockers was midway through the thing, he started doing some collaborative work, and all of a sudden you saw in an insert on the screen, you saw the picture of Bill Paxton, who was 45 miles away down in Menlo Park, live. Both of them had their mouse pointers on the screen, and they were actually doing the kinds of things that people still dream about today. So this is a complete vision. And I think of it as the vision of what we today call personal computing or desktop computing. So except for the fact that the processor was a big time-shared computer, all of the paraphernalia, Engelbart used a black and white display, 19-inch display, using video to blow up a calligraphic screen, and had a mouse. And if you look at the thing today, you'd see something that looked like somebody's office that you could walk into. And what remained was to do something about the problems in response time and all of that stuff. And that was something that I had gotten interested in a few years before. And the first machine that I did was a thing called the Flex machine. And
just before we go on to Flex,
yeah.
Just tell me before we go on, what was the reaction like among the computer?
Well, I didn't take a. In fact, I was actually, as I recall, I actually was rather. I had the flu or something, but I was determined to go see this. I think ARPA had spent something like $175,000 on this demo, and everybody in the ARPA community wanted to show up. I recall that the crowd, he got a standing ovation, and it won the best paper in the Fall Joint Computing Conference and so forth. And what was even better is that he had brought up 4 or 5 terminals to this system and had them in a room, and people could go in and actually learn to interact with the system a bit. So it was a large-scale demonstration. I don't think that anybody has ever traced what people did over the next 15 or 20 years as the result of having been at that demonstration. That would be interesting.
Doug hoped it would change the face of computing, and is very disappointed that it didn't. He thinks it didn't really have much.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things that Doug. I mean, we thought of Doug as Moses opening the Red Sea. He was like a biblical prophet, and like a biblical prophet, he believed very much in his own particular vision. And that vision was not a 100% good idea. One of the things that they neglected completely was the learnability of the system. So the people who used this system were all computer experts who loved it, were willing to memorize hundreds of commands in order to be, if you memorize hundreds of commands and you learn how to use the key set, you could fly through this n-dimensional space. It was quite exhilarating to watch people doing it. It was exhilarating to learn how to do it. The problem with it, though, is that there are so many barriers towards learning, and there are many other things that were problems. It wasn't a particularly good simulation of paper, partly because he didn't want it to be. And so the idea that there would be a transition period where you would be producing documents, of course they printed documents out, but there's no notion of desktop publishing there. So the whole system was rather like a violin. And if you were willing to learn how to become the violinist, you could play incredible music through the thing. And of course, all of us were completely sold on this system in the late '60s. And the first machine that I did, the Flex machine, was an echo of this.
Now, the Flex machine, the other element which is in this, apart from these fantastic software achievements of Sutherland and Engelbart, is of course the size of the machine. There were some precedents, weren't there?
Oh yes, yeah. The first personal computer, in my opinion, was the machine called the Link. If you include size as one of the important things, of course, you could say that the Whirlwind was a personal computer at MIT, or the TX2. Some people tried to get Ivan Sutherland to write a paper called "When There Was Only One Personal Computer," and that was him using Sketchpad on the TX2, which is this thing bigger than a house. But in 1962, Wes Clark did a machine in which part of the design parameter was it was small enough to look over when you were sitting down at a desk. So it was not supposed to loom over you. So it's something you could actually see over it. And many important things were done on that machine. In fact, quite a few hundred, if not a few thousand of them were built and used in the biomedical community. It was designed for biomedical research, designed to be programmed by its users who are not computer scientists, even designed to be built by non-computer scientists. They used to have gatherings in the summertime where 30 people or so would come and build their own links and then take them back and stuff. It was a great little machine. Had a little display and display editors and so forth. And so it was something that you could point to when you were trying to think of what to do. And there were other small things. There was a machine called the IBM 1130, which was really an abortion of a machine. It was sort of a key punch keyboard hooked to one of the early removable disk packs. And I mean, this was a mess of a machine. But it was the size of a desk, and you could sit down. It wasn't designed really to be programmed, except by storing programs on cards. Very funny. You can only store data on the disk. IBM forced you to put the programs on punch cards. That's the only way you could feed them in. It was really hilarious. So there are lots of different kinds of things like that.
Yeah. So what were you trying to do with Flex? What was the...
Well, I worked on this machine with a guy by the name of Ed Cheadle, who was really trying to invent what today we would call personal computing. He had a little machine, and he had a little Sony television set, and what he wanted was something for engineers that would allow them to flex. He was an engineer, and he wanted something that would allow them to flexibly do calculations beyond the kinds of things that you do with a calculator. So you should be able to program the machine in something. You should be able to store the programs away. You should be able to get it to do things. And then I sort of came in and corrupted the design by wanting it to be for people other than engineers. So I'd seen JOS, and I'd also recently seen one of the first object-oriented programming languages, and I realized how important that could be. And then Sheila and I escalated. The problem is that he and I got along really well, and so we escalated this design beyond the means of the time to build it practically. But we did build one, and it had many things that people associate today. It fit on top of a desk, special desks that weighed hundreds of pounds. But it had a fan likened to a 747 taking off, because the integrated circuits back then had maybe 8 or 16 gates on a chip, so this thing had about 700 chips in it, and had a high resolution calligraphic display. It had a tablet on it, and it had a user interface that included multiple windows, things like icons and stuff. But it was rather like trying to assemble a meal, maybe make an apple pie for random things you find in the kitchen, like no flour, so you grind up Cheerios, and you wind up with this thing that looks sort of like an apple pie, but actually isn't very palatable. So the result of this machine was a technological success and a sociological disaster, and it was the magnitude of the rejection by non-computer people we tried it on that got me thinking about user interface for the first time. And I realized that what Cliff Shaw had done in JOS was not a luxury but a necessity, and so it led to other ways of looking at things.
So if we go back to originally, you were saying people thought of mainframes as like factories, right?
Yeah.
These early attempts at personal computers are what, like Model T?
Yeah, I think Engelbart. I think one of the ways that we commonly thought about Engelbart stuff is that he was trying to be Henry Ford. That you could think of the computer as a railroad, and the liberating thing for a railroad is a personal automobile. And Engelbart thought of what you were doing on his system as traveling. So you're moving around from link to link in the hyperspace, and he used terms like thought vectors and concept space and stuff. Nobody knew what it meant, and I'm not sure he did either. But it was that kind of a metaphor.
What's wrong with that metaphor?
Well, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with it, but when you're doing things by analogy, you always want to try and pick the right analogy because there's so many ways of making them. And the thing that was limiting about it, when you apply it to humanity, as an example, is a car you expect to take a few months to learn how to do it. That was certainly true. It's something that doesn't extend into the world of the child. There's a whole bunch of things, but of course we didn't think of it that way. We thought of the car as one of the great things of the 20th century, and it changed our society and everything. And so we were definitely using that as a metaphor. And in fact, the thing that changed my mind had nothing to do with rejecting the car as a metaphor. It was finding a better metaphor, one that was completely possessed me. And that came about from seeing quite a different system. I had called the Flex machine a personal computer. I think that was the first use of that term. And while I was trying to figure out what was wrong with it, I happened to visit Rand Corporation over here in Santa Monica and saw sort of a follow-on system to JOS that they had done for their end users, who were people like Rand economists. And these people loved JOS, but they hated to type. And so in the same year the mouse was invented, the Rand people had invented the first really good tablet. It was a high-resolution thing, and they decided that the thing to do was to get rid of keyboards entirely. And so the first really good hand character recognizer was developed there, and they built an entire system out of it called Grail, for graphical input language. So there's no keyboard at all. You interacted directly with the things on the screen. You could move them around. If you did a square on the screen, if you drew a square, it would recognize you were trying to draw a square. It would make one. If you put in your hand printed characters, it would recognize them and straighten them up. And the system was designed for building simulations of the kinds that economists and other scientists would like to build. And using this system was completely different from using the Engelbart system. On this system, it felt like you were sinking your fingers right through the glass of the display and touching the information structures directly inside. And if what Engelbart was doing was the dawn of personal computing, what the Rand people were doing was the dawn of intimate computing.
At intimate computing, you forget that it's a machine, and you think of it.
Yeah, you start it, and one of the things that completely took hold of me in using the Grail system was it felt more like a musical instrument than anything, because the musical instrument is something that most musicians don't think of their instruments as machines, and it's that closeness of contact, the fitness, that you're directly dealing with content rather than the form of the content that possessed me very strongly. And I saw that was in 1968 as well. And I saw another several things. I saw Seymour Papert's early work with Logo, where here were children writing programs, and that happened because they had taken great care to try and combine the power of the computer with an easy-to-use language. In fact, they used the Rand JOS as a model and used the power of Lisp, which had been developed a few years before as an artificial intelligence language, put them together, and that was the early Logo. And to see children confidently programming just blew out the whole notion of the automobile metaphor. And the thing that replaced it was that this is a medium. This is like pencil and paper. We can't wait until the kids are seniors in high school to give them driver's ed on the thing. They have to start using it practically from birth the way they use pencil and paper. And it was destined not to be packaged on a desktop, because we don't carry our desks with it. It had to be something much smaller. And that was when I first started seriously thinking about a notebook computer. And of course, the first thing I wanted to know after deciding that it had to be no larger than this was, when would that be possible, if ever? And so I started looking at what the integrated circuit people were doing, Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce and stuff, and there were these nice projections that they, as confident physicists, had made about where silicon can go. And what's wonderful is these projections have only been off by a few percent now, more than 20 years later. And of course I was very enthusiastic. I would believe anything that was in the right direction. So I took this hook, line, and sinker and said, okay, 20 years from now, we'll be able to have a notebook-size computer that we can not only do all the wonderful things on computers, we can do mundane things too, because that's what paper is all about. You can write a Shakespearean sonnet on it, but you can also put your grocery list on it. So one of the questions I asked back in 1968 is, what kind of a computer would it have to be for you to do something so mundane as to put your grocery list on it, be willing to carry it into a supermarket, and be willing to carry it out with a couple of bags of groceries? There's nothing special about that. You can do it with paper. So the question is the question is not whether you replace paper or not. The question is whether you can cover the old medium with the new, and then you have all these marvelous things that you can do with the new medium that you can't do with the old.
Now, many people find the idea of a medium a tricky concept. What in the sense you're talking about, writing and so forth, or music, what do you mean?
Well, I think most of my thoughts about media were shaped by reading McLuhan, which not everybody agrees with, but one of his points is that the notion of intermediary is something that is not added on to humans. It's sort of what we are. We deal with the world through intermediaries. We deal with we can't fit the world into our brain. We don't have a one-to-one representation of the world in our brain. We have something that is an abstraction from it, and so the very representations that our mentality uses to deal with the world is an intermediary. So we kind of live in a waking hallucination, and we have language as an intermediary, we have clothes as an intermediary. So this whole notion of what we think of as technology could also be replaced by the word medium. And I think there's even though media has this connotation of the news business and stuff like that, I think it's an awfully good word because it gives us this notion of something being between us and direct experience.
Now, of those media, writing and printing, obviously, as a media, we can sort of think about that had great power. Now, and music as well.
Yeah.
And what does that really consist of?
Well, I think that the trade-off with using any kind of intermediary is that every time you put something between you and direct experience, you're alienating a bit, and what you hope to get back from it is some kind of amplification. Various people who have studied evolution talk about the difference between the direct experience you get from kinesthetically touching something to the indirect experience you get of seeing it. And one is less involving than the other. The seeing is a good one because it means you don't have to test out every cliff by walking over it. And so there's an enormous survival value about stepping back. To have a brain that can plan and envision things that might happen, whether as images or even more strongly in terms of symbols, is of tremendous survival value because it allows you to try out many more alternatives. And so, as the existentialists of this century have pointed out, that we have gained our power over the world at the cost of alienating ourselves. So the thing that
a computer is anything but a machine. So I wonder if you could try. Why should that be a medium?
Well, I think machine is a word that has a connotation that's unfortunate. And maybe what we should do is either elevate what we think of when we say machine, mechanism kind of thing, or maybe use a different word. To most scientists, machines are not a dirty word because one of the ways we think about things, even in biology these days, is that what we are is an immensely complicated mechanism. And that's not to say that it's predictable in the sense of free will, because there's this notion now that people are familiar with called chaotic systems and systems that are somewhat unstable, and there's a lot of instability and stuff built in. It's a little more stochastic in a way, but the idea that there are things operating against each other and they make larger things, and those things are part of larger things, and so forth, to most scientists seems like a beautiful thing. It's not a derogatory term.
I think it's also that most machines were built to do useful work. I mean, this machine, in processing information, has properties which are sort of linguistic as well as.
Yeah, well, I think the connotation of machine is something that has to do with the physical world. Most people who haven't learned mathematics have never encountered the notion of an algorithm, which is a process for producing. And you could think of your moving around physical things called symbols. I mean, something physical is always being moved around. That's the way scientists look at the world. And it's the real question is this a trivial example of it, or is this an unbelievably interesting example of it? So a flower is a very interesting example of a machine, and a lever is a somewhat trivial and more understandable notion of a machine.
Now these machines can move around symbols, presumably like the electronic voltages or whatever, so fast that they can dynamically simulate virtually anything
Lots
you want. Lots of things.
Lots of things. Yeah, one way to think of it is a lot of what a computer is markings. And just as it doesn't matter whether you make the markings for a book on metal or paper, or you can make them in clay, all kinds of ways of making the equivalent of a book. The main thing about a marking is you have to have some way of distinguishing from other markings. And once you've got that, then they can act as carriers of different kinds of descriptions. And the range of the markings that you can have in a book and the range of markings you can have in a computer are the same.
So like in a computer, it started with punch cards and
yeah, it doesn't matter what it is. You can there's a wonderful computer built out of Tinkertoy in the Computer Museum of Boston. It was done by some MIT grad students. You can make it out of anything. And so that's one set of ideas, that it's the representational properties of things are very, very much like a book. And then the computer has this even more wonderful thing, is that it's a book that can read and write itself. And moreover, it can do it very quickly. So it has this self-reflexivity that you usually only find in biological systems. And it can carry through these descriptions very, very rapidly. Okay, and then everything, that's the big nirvana experience where you suddenly realize, holy smokes, this thing is a pocket universe. And it has a nice complementary role to the way we deal with our physical universe as scientists. The physical universe, especially in the 19th century, it was thought that it was put there by God, and it was the job of scientists to uncover this glorious mechanism. So in the computer, what you do is you start off with a theory, and the computer will bring that theory to life. So you can have a theory of a universe that is different than our own, like it has an inverse cube law of gravity. And you can sit down and in not too much time you can program up a simulation of that and discover right away that you don't get orbits anymore with planets. And that's curious, and a little more thinking and deeper delving will soon make you discover that only the inverse square law will actually give you orbits.
That's a curious thing. The other way you put it once is you could invent a universe with no gravity, right?
Yes. And in fact, I think it's again the difference between a physical book, which when you can drop it and it will fall down to the floor, and the story that's in the book that could be about a place that has no gravity, like out in space. And the computer is at once a physical thing, and the stories that it holds don't have to have anything to do with the physical universe its components reside in. So in other words, you can lie both with books and with computers, and it's important because if you couldn't lie, you couldn't get into the future. Because we are living a world of things that were complete lies 500 years ago.
Now the thing about the computer as well is, apart from being dynamic, its ability to simulate means that it can embody all other media. It is the first metamedia,
Yes.
isn't it?
Yes, I called it the first metamedium in the early 70s when I was trying to explain what it was as being distinct from big mainframes with whirling tape drives. That the physical media that we have, like paper and the way it takes on markings are fairly easy to simulate. The higher the resolution display you get, the more you can make things look like a high resolution television camera looking at paper. So that was one of the things that we were interested in at Xerox PARC, was to do that kind of simulation. And there are deeper simulations than the simulation of physical media. There's the simulation of physical processes as well.
Now, if then, this is pretty mind-blowing, because the computer then is not just important as a versatile tool, a new machine. What we're talking about is something of the gravity of the invention of writing or printing. In cultural terms, we're talking about something really pretty fantastic.
Right, and it's sort of sneaking its way in the way the book did. The Catholic Church didn't. I think the Catholic Church thought that the book might be a way of getting more Bibles written in Latin, and so by the time they started thinking about suppressing it, it was too late, because, of course, you could print all these other things, and all of a sudden you go from having 300 or 400 books in the Vatican Library in the year 1400 to something 100 or 150 years later, where there are some 40,000 different books in circulation in Europe, and 80% of the population could read them. And so all of a sudden you have something totally at odds with most ways of dealing with religion, which is multiple points of view.
What can we learn, looking at the history of the book, really? What can we learn? Clearly it took a lot longer to happen, right, for one thing, but what were the stages it had to go through to get accepted? Yeah,
well, I think in doing these analogies, analogies can be suggestive. And of course the amount that analogy carries through from one place to another depends on lots of things. I happen to like the analogy to the book quite a bit, because you have several stages. You have the invention of writing, which is a huge idea, incredibly important, and the difference between having it and not having it is enormous. The difference between having computers, even if they're just big mainframes, and not having them is enormous. They're just things you cannot do without them. Then the next stage was the Gutenberg stage, and Gutenberg, just as McLuhan liked to say, when a new medium comes along, it imitates the old. So Gutenberg's books were the same size as these beautiful illuminated manuscripts that were done by hand, and big like this. And in the libraries of the day back then, the books generally weren't shelved. There were so few books in a given library that they actually had their own reading table. And if you look at woodcuts of the day, it looks for all the world like a time-sharing bullpen. You go into there's a library in Florence that's set up that way. So you go over to the table that the particular book is at. They were chained in because they're too valuable. They're priceless. And Gutenberg imitated that, but of course he could produce many more books. But he didn't know what size they should be, and it was some decades later that Aldus Manutius, who is a Venetian publisher, decided that books should be this size. And he decided they should be this size because that was the size that saddlebags were in Venice in the late 1400s. And the key idea that he had was that books could now be lost. And because books could now be lost, they could now be taken with you. And they couldn't be like this. They had to be something that was a portable size. And I think in very important respects, where we are today is before Aldus. Because this notion that a computer can be lost is not one that we like yet. We protect our computers. We bolt them to the desk and so forth.
Because they're still quite valuable. Still
quite expensive. They'll be really valuable when we can lose them.
The other point about the point of literacy, is also well taken there. While there are no books to read, I presume there's no point in.
Right. Well, if reading and writing is a profession, you don't have the notion of literacy and illiteracy. Like, there's no word in our language that stands for ill medicine. Right? There's medicine, which is practiced by professionals, and there's no notion of ill medicine. Now, if we all learned medicine, if that were part of, and it may be someday that staying healthy might be something that becomes an important part of everyone's life, then there'll be a notion of medicine and ill medicine. And so it wasn't until there was a potential for the masses to read that we had the notion of literacy and illiteracy. And to me, the literacy has three major parts that you have to contend with. One is you have to have a skill to access material prepared for you by somebody else, regardless of what it is that you're trying to be literate in. In print medium, it's called reading, accessing. And I don't think many people in our society would think that a person who just could read was literate, because you have to be able to create ideas and put them into the information stream. So you have creative literacy, which is the equivalent of writing. And then finally, after a medium has been around for a while, you have the problem that there are different genres of these things, so that you have to go into a different gear to read a Shakespearean play. Now, it's a different way of doing it. The way they wrote essays 200 years ago is different than the way they write essays today, and so you have to have some sort of literacy in the different styles for representing things. And so I think those three things, when something new comes along, since we're talking about media, we can talk about mediacy and ill-mediacy, or computeracy and ill-computeracy, or something like that. And I think each one of those things is a problem that has to be solved. There's the problem of how can you, when you get something new made for a computer, be able to do the equivalent of read it, of access what it is. So you go to a computer store and get some new wonderful thing, slap it into your computer, and if you have to learn a new language in order to use the thing, then things are not set up for you being computer literate.
So writing in Latin would be analogous to rather different.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with that. And again, to sort of strain the analogy we're making with printing, my other hero back then was Martin Luther, who a few years later had this intense desire to let people have a personal relationship with God without going through the intermediaries of the church. And he wanted people to be able to read the Bible in their own language, and knew that German, which was a bunch of different regional dialects back then, mostly for talking about farming and stuff, was not going to be able to carry the weight of the Bible as it was portrayed in Latin, which is a much more robust and mature language. So Martin Luther had to invent the language we today call High German before he could translate the Bible into it. And so the language that the Germans speak today is in a very large part the invention of a single person who did it as a user interface so that he could bring the medium much closer to the people rather than trying to get everybody in Germany to learn Latin.
Now, without that sort of insight, we can think of this whole process of literacy took a long time, took many centuries. Now we can, as you say, the early phases of the computer have gone quite much more rapidly, haven't they?
Right.
Yeah.
I think we're things are going more rapidly, but also to the extent that analogies help. Certainly that progression. I happen to be a big fan of books, and I happen to know that progression of illuminated manuscripts, which I absolutely adored when I was a child. The Gutenberg story, the Aldous story, was one of my great heroes because he was the guy who decided you had to read more than one book. And then Martin Luther. Those immediately sprang to mind as soon as I had decided that the computer wasn't a car anymore. And then the thing becomes the two most powerful things that you have to do right away. You don't have to wait to gradually figure them out. You have to get the thing small, and you have to find a language that will allow people, that will bring what it is closer to the people rather than the other way around.
Now, an opportunity came for you. I mean, I know you were going to make your Dynabook one way or another, but an opportunity came for you to go
right.
to a brand new center.
Yeah, I thought up the Dynabook in 1968 and made a cardboard model of it. And a couple of years later, I was about to go to Carnegie Mellon University to do the thing. And I had been consulting a little bit for the newly formed Xerox PARC, and it just got to be too much fun, so I never wound up going to Pittsburgh.
What was Xerox PARC?
Xerox PARC was an an attempt by Xerox to spend part of its research and development money on really far out stuff that was not going to be particularly controlled by them. In the late 60s, they bought themselves a computer company. They bought a whole bunch of publishers. They were trying to get into a larger sphere than just office copiers. One of the ringing phrases of the late 60s was Xerox should be the architects of information. And so they had this expansive feeling about getting into other areas, and they got Jack Goldman in, who was a scientist at Ford, and as the new chief scientist at Xerox. And Jack realized that what we actually had to have at Xerox was something like a long-range research center. Xerox was a big company even then, and what Jack decided to do is to hire George Paik, who was the chancellor of Washington University in St. Louis. And George was quite familiar with ARPA, and so he hired Bob Taylor, who had been one of the funders of ARPA in the 60s. Taylor was one of the champions of Engelbart, one of the champions of the work at RAND and so forth. And what Taylor did was to, instead of hiring random good scientists, what he did was to decide to set up a miniature concentrated ARPA community. So he went out after all of the people he thought were the best in the ARPA research community, and those people were somewhat interested because the Mansfield Amendment was shutting down, constricting the kinds of far-out things that ARPA could do. So it was one of those things where...
What was the Mansfield Amendment?
Mansfield Amendment was an overreaction to the Vietnam War. A lot of people were worried about various kinds of government and especially military funding on campus and secret funding and all of this stuff. And the ARPA information processing techniques projects got swept up in this, even though every single one of them was public domain and had already been spun off into dozens of companies, including DEC. And so this is just one of these broad brush things done by Congress that happened to kill off one of the best things that's ever been set up in this country. And so a lot of smart people in universities who believed more or less the same dream about the destiny of computers were gathered up by Taylor, and I was one of those.
So how good were you were talking about the people that were gathered. I mean, how good were they?
Well, I thought they were the best.
We'll start again. We'll just let that one go back.
Okay.
Okay. Right. So how good were they on?
I thought the people that were there were among the very best. In my personal pick, by 1976, which was about 6 years after the place had started, there were 58 out of my personal pick of the top 100 in the world there, and divided into a couple of labs. People who had very strong opinions, who normally would not work with each other at all in any normal situation, were welded together by having known each other in the past, having come up through the ARPA community, believing more or less the same things. Of course, when you have that kind of level of people, the disagreements in the 10th decimal place become significant. But it worked out very well because we were able to get together completely on joint hardware projects. So we built all of our own hardware as well as all of our own software there, and the hardware was shared amongst the many different kinds of groups that were there. So there's one set of hardware as we moved on from year to year, and then many different kinds of software design.
Xerox had this idea of the architecture of information, rather general concept. What did you guys think you were doing?
Well, the psychology of that kind of person is would be thought of as being arrogant in most situations. We thought we knew. We didn't know exactly what we were going to do, but we were quite sure that nobody else could do it better, whatever it was. And the architect of information, that was a phrase that sounded good. It didn't actually mean anything. And there was some mumbling also about if paper goes away in the office in the next 25 years, Xerox should be the company to do it because that was their heartland business. But Taylor was setting the place up to realize the ARPA dream, which was to do man-computer symbiosis, and in all of the different directions that ARPA had been interested in the past, which included interactive computing, which included artificial intelligence and the notion of agents. So there are projects that range from being intensely practical ones, like Gary Starkweather doing the first laser printer, and Metcalf and other people doing the Ethernet, the first packet switching local area net. Thacker being the main designer of the Alto, which is the first workstation and the first computer to look like the Macintosh. I was head of a group that was interested in the Dynabook design, and a lot of the things that we came up with for the Dynabook were simulated on the Alto and became part of the first notion of what workstations and personal computers should be like. And those included things like the icons and the multiple overlapping windows and the whole paraphernalia that you see on machines like the Macintosh today.
And the basic idea was the sort of machine you were interested in was one which had the capacity to handle rich graphical interfaces but could be networked together. So it had to have more standalone power than time sharing. Is that true?
Yeah, in fact, one of the things we were incredibly interested in was how powerful did it have to be. We used phrases like, we didn't know how powerful it had to be, but it had to be able to handle something like 90 or 95% of the things that you would generally like to do before you wanted to go to something more. Of course, we didn't know what that meant. We thought it would be somewhere around 10 MIPS, was sort of the rule of thumb. The machine we built was effectively, it was somewhere between 1 and 3 MIPS, depending on how you measured it. And so it was less powerful than we thought. On the other hand, it was about 50 times as powerful as a time-sharing terminal. So the magnification of what we could aspire to was enormous. And the machine was not done blindly. It was done after about a year of studying things like fonts and what happens when the eye looks at little dots on screens and what animation means. And we did a bunch of real-time music, very early synthesis kinds of stuff. And so we knew a lot about what the machine should be and how fast it should run.
So to design this machine and the software that went with it, you studied human beings?
A lot of us did. I mean, what was nice here is I was one of the drivers on wanting these small machines. There were other groups at this time in 1971 when PARC was forming who were building a large time-sharing system to act as a kind of an institutional resource for PARC. There are lots of different things going on. I wanted to do stuff with children because my feeling after doing the Flex machine was that we, and I especially, were not very good at designing systems for adults. And so then I thought, well, children have to use this thing. Why don't we'll forget about adults for a while. We'll just design a tool for children, a medium for children, and we'll see what happens. So I desperately wanted to get a bunch of these systems. I needed like 15 of them. I needed to have them in a school somehow with children because I wanted to see how children reacted to these things and improve the design that way.
Yeah, we'll keep going. Don't worry about that. So, but the idea was that when you use children, this threw into focus many of the problems you were trying to solve. What was the?
Yeah, I don't know that it threw into the shock when you go out to real users of any kind is enormous because technical people live in this tiny little world, actually. We like to think it's a big world, but it's actually a tiny little world. And it's full of phrases that we learned when we were taking math classes. And it's hermetic. And it's full of people who like to learn complicated things. They delight in it. And so one of the hardest thing is for these kind of people to do any kind of user interface for people who are not like that at all. That's the number one dictum of user interface design, is the users are not like us. And so what you need to have is some way of constantly shocking yourself into realizing that the users are not like us. And children do it really well because they don't care about the same kinds of things that adults do. And they're not like this, they're not like that. They can always go out and play ball. They haven't learned to feel guilty about not working yet, And the last thing you want to do is subject the children to more school. You don't want to put them through a training course to learn a computing system. So we use the term forcing function. It was a setup where in many ways it's harder to design a system for children than it is for adults along a couple of avenues. And it forced us to start thinking about how human mentalities might work.
These were your Smalltalk kids, were they?
These eventually became the Smalltalk kids. And the lead into that was that Seymour Papert had gotten a lot of good ideas from having worked with Piaget. And Piaget had a notion of the evolution of mentality in early childhood as being sort of like a caterpillar into a butterfly. And the most important idea of it was that at each stage of development, that the kid was not a deficient adult, but was a fully functioning organism. It just didn't think about the world quite the same way as adults did. And other psychologists like Jerome Brunner had similar ideas, also inspired by Piaget.
What were these basic stages for?
Well, if you break them down into just 3 stages, it's one in which a lot of thinking is done just by grabbing. A hole is to dig it, an object is to grab it. And then the next stage is very visual, in which many of the judgments that you make about the world are dominated by the way things look. So in this stage you have the Piaget water pouring experiment. You pour from a squat glass into a tall, thin one, and the kid in this stage says there's more water in the tall, thin one. He doesn't have an underlying notion, a symbolic notion that quantities are conserved. Doesn't have what Piaget calls conservation. But conservation is not a visual idea. Visual, it's what does it look like when you compare it. And then later on, you get the stage that Piaget called the symbolic stage, where facts and logic start to dominate the ways of thinking. And a child in that stage knows as a fact that water doesn't appear and disappear, nor does anything else. And so is able to give you judgments that are inferences based on these facts rather than by the way things appear. Now, Brunner did a lot of these experiments over again and added some sort of side trips into them. So one of the things he did in the water pouring experiment was to intersperse a cardboard after the child had said there's more water in a tall, thin glass. And the kid immediately changed what he had just said. He said, oh no, there can't be more, because where would it come from? And Brunner took the card away, and the kid changed back. He said, no, look, there is more. Brunner put the card back, and the kid said, no, there can't be more. Where would it come from? And so if you have any 6-year-olds you'd like to torment, this is a pretty good way of doing it. And Brunner, the way Brunner interpreted this is that we actually have separate ways of knowing about the world. One of them is kinesthetic, one of them is visual, one of them is symbolic. And of course, we have other ways as well. And that these ways are in parallel. They really constitute separate mentalities. And because of their evolutionary history, they are both rather distinct in the way that they deal with the world, and they are not terribly well integrated with each other. So you can get some remarkable results by telling people an English sentence, which they'll accept, and then showing them a picture that represents exactly the same thing and have an enormous emotional reaction.
How is this going to help your interface design?
Well, we're clutching at straws. You do anything when you don't know what to do. But it seemed like a reasonable thing to, since we're going to be dealing with humans, it seemed like a reasonable thing to try and get something out of the newly formed cognitive psychology to do it. And the thing that got me, the Piaget stuff didn't help me much, because one of the ways of interpreting it is that, for example, you shouldn't probably teach first graders arithmetic because they aren't quite set up to receive it yet. You'd be better off teaching them something that's more kinesthetic, like geometry or topology. They're tying their shoes and stuff, and there are a whole bunch of things you can do with knots and things that are higher mathematics. But the particular symbolic manipulations of arithmetic are not easy for them at that stage. Well, that's important when you're designing curriculum in schools, but it didn't tell us much about a user interface. The Brunner thing, though, was really exciting, because one of the ways of interpreting it is that at every age in a person's life, there are these multiple mentalities there. Now, when the kid is 6 years old, the symbolic one may not be functioning very much, but there are tricks that you can get it to function. And Brunner had this notion that you could take an idea that's normally only taught symbolically, like some physical principle, and teach it to a 6-year-old kinesthetically and to a 10-year-old visually. And later on to a 15-year-old, you could teach it symbolically, this notion of a spiral. And Papert had the same idea, that if you want to learn how a gyroscope works, the last thing you want to do is look at the equation. What you want to do is do a little bit of visual reasoning about the thing, and then have one in your hand in the form of a big bicycle wheel. And when you turn that bicycle wheel and feel what it does, it clicks together with a small amount of reasoning you're doing, and all of a sudden you understand why it has to flop the other way, that there's nothing that mysterious about it. But from the outside and looking at the equation, and thinking about cross products and stuff like that, it just doesn't make any sense. So Brunner's idea was, when you don't know what else to do in developing a curriculum, try recapitulating the Piagetian stages. Cast this adult level knowledge down into a kinesthetic form and recast it later on. Teach it over and over again. Recast it later on in a visual form. And he thought of these lower mentalities, kinesthetic and iconic mentalities, as being what we call intuition. That they can't talk much, but they have their own figurative ways of knowing about the world that supply a nice, warm way of thinking about physical problems.
Now, Engelbart had some of these already. The mouse is a kinesthetic.
Yes, but not a good one. It's okay, but if you only use it to point on the screen, it's not very kinesthetic, because the major operation in kinesthesia is grabbing something and moving it. And Engelbart did not have that. And that was one of the first. Now, of course, people have been moving things around in computer graphics, and most people who had ever done this liked it better. So the first little paper I wrote about the Dynabook talked about moving things around, and Grail moved things around, Sketchpad moves things around. It's a natural thing when you're thinking about things from a graphics center, which Engelbart wasn't. Even though he had a little bit of graphics, he was thinking about it from text. Think about things from a graphics center. It's natural to want to just move something around. And so the connection with what had already been done with what Brunner was saying got us thinking a little bit more strongly about what the mouse was supposed to be about. The mouse was not just for indicating things on the screen. It was to give you a kinesthetic entry into this world. Now, the important thing about it is that I don't know how all scientific discoveries are made. They usually are connected together with little flashes of insight over long periods of time. But in fact, when I started off, I was quite sure that Brunner had the key, and we got the ingredients rather early for doing the user interface. But it was remarkable to me how many people we had to try ideas out on for years, 3 or 4 years. We had to not only build the system, but in fact the early versions of the system were not as good as later versions of the system. And it actually took about 5 years and dealing with hundreds of people to come out with the first thing that was that sort of looked like the Mac.
And this is like the desktop.
Yeah, the desktop was actually an idea we didn't like particularly. That was something that was developed when Xerox was thinking specifically of going at offices.
This was the icons Windows point.
Yeah, in the Dynabook idea. So when you have a Dynabook and you have simulations and multidimensional things as your major way of storing knowledge, the last thing you want to do is print any of it out, right? Because you're destroying the multidimensionality and you can't run them. So if you have so one of the rules is if you have anything interesting in your computer, you don't want to print it. And that's why if your computer is always with you, you won't print it. When you give it to somebody else, what you're sending to them is something that was in your Dynabook to their Dynabook. Okay, and the user interface that we worked on was very much aimed at that, and so it had a different notion than the desktop is sort of a smaller version of it. Right. So what we had was this. You could think of it as multiple desks if you want, but we had this notion that people wanted to work on projects. And I especially like to work on multiple projects, and people used to accuse me of abandoning my desk, and it got piled up, and I go to another one and pile it up. And when I'm working on multiple things, I like to have a table full of all the crap that goes there, and another table, and so forth, so everything is in the state it was when I last left it. And that was the user interface that we wound up doing, where you could move from one project to another project, and you could think of it if you did it on the Macintosh, you could think of it as having multiple Macintosh desks, each one of which was all the tools for that particular project.
The reason why you used the term intuitive before, or we feel things that use our kinesthetic and iconic mentality intuitive. Also, the term leverage is used. Can you tell me what you mean when you say when you succeed, when you confer leverage on a user?
Yeah, well, I mean, another part of my background, before I was heavily into computer science, was theater. And if you think about it, theater is kind of an absurd setup because you have perhaps a balding person in his 40s impersonating a teenage in triumph holding a skull in front of cardboard scenery, right? It can't possibly work. But in fact, it does all the time. And the reason it does is that theater, the theatrical experience, is a mirror that blasts the audience's intelligence back out at them. So it's as somebody once said, people don't come to the theater to forget; they come tingling to remember. And so what it is an evoker. And again, having the thing go from an automobile to a medium started me thinking about the user interface as a theatrical notion. And what you do in the theater is to take something that is impossibly complex, like human existence or something, and present it in something that is more like stereotypes, which the user can then resynthesize human existence out of. I think it was Picasso who said that art is not the truth, art is a lie that tells the truth. And so I started thinking about the user interface as something that was a lie, namely, it really isn't what's going on inside the computer, but it nonetheless tells the truth because it's a different kind of computer. It evokes what the computer can do in the user's mind, and that's what you're trying to do. So that's the computer they wind up going, and that's what I think of as leverage.
So just as with time sharing, you've got the illusion it's okay.
It's okay.
Pause for a second.
Pause for a second. This is happening. Sorry, we're running.
You could probably build a computer out of duct tape.
Steve? Yes, so just as with time sharing, you sort of had the illusion that you had exclusive use of the computer. Here, you have a different illusion that you're moving things that there are objects on your screen.
Yes, in fact, we use the term user illusion. I don't think we ever used the term user interface, or at least certainly not in the early days. And we did not use the term metaphor, like as in desktop metaphor. That was something that I think came along later. The idea was what can you do theatrically that will cover the amount of magic that you want the person to be able to experience? Because the understanding was in the theater, you don't have to present the world as physicists see it, but if you're going to have magic in Act 3, you better foreshadow it in Act 1. And so there's this whole notion of how do you dress the set in order to set up expectations that will later turn out to be true in the audience's mind.
Now, while you were working on these things, other people at PART were building a machine.
They were building various machines, and it was kind of funny because the way it worked out is took Wes Clark's Link design and came up with a version, a sort of a modern version of that in a little handheld, it was sort of like a suitcase that I called Minicom, and has done some design of how things would run on it. And the problem was it wasn't powerful enough, but it was something I figured I could get 15 or 20 of them for the experiments that we wanted, and I had designed the first version of Smalltalk for this machine. And much to my amazement, I got turned down flat by a nameless Xerox executive, and I was crushed. No, we're doing time share. Sorry.
We got the beeping.
Yeah, we'll start
Okay.
again. Yeah, so just were we wide? Just
We were tight.
We were tight. So just come wide. So just go from where you said you were turned down from a Xerox executive.
Okay, so there's I couldn't believe that a nameless Xerox executive turned me down flat as far as the idea of building a bunch of these things, and I was crushed. And I was 31 years old then, and just it's terrible. And so then I evolved another scheme of getting a bunch of little mini computers, like Data General Novas, and I could only afford 5 of those. I had something like $230,000 or so, and I figured 5 of those, and take the system that we're experimenting with fonts and bitmap displays on, and I'll replicate that. I'll get 5 of them. It's an incredibly expensive way to do it, but that would give me 5 machines to do stuff. And then this Xerox executive went away on a task force, and Chuck Thacker and Butler Lamson came over to me in September of 1972 and said to me, "Have you got any money?" And I said, "Well, I've got about $230,000. And they said, "Well, how would you like us to build you your machine?" And I said, "I'd like it fine." And so what I gave them was the results of the experiments I'd done in fonts and bitmap graphics, plus we had done some prototyping of animation and music. So that to do all of these things, it had to be so fast. And what happened there was a combination of my interest in a very small machine, in Butler Lamson's interest in a $500 PDP-10 someday, and Chuck Thacker wanted to build a machine 10 times as fast as a Data General Nova. And Chuck was the hardware genius, so he got to decide what it was in the end, and he went off and in 3.5 months with 2 technicians completely built the first machine that had the bitmap display. And he built it not as small as I wanted it, but 10 times faster than I had planned, and it was a larger capacity machine. So it was simultaneously both the first thing that was like a Mac and the first workstation.
And this was the Alto.
An absolute triumph, yeah, this was the Alto.
Just before we discuss that, what was the bitmap display? Why was that?
Well, that was fairly controversial, because the problem is that bits were expensive back then. And before about 1971, bits were intolerably expensive because they're in memory, they're in forms of these little magnetic cores, and just even a modest memory was many cubic feet, required expensive read-sense amplifiers, and power supply. It was a mess. And in the early 70s, Intel came out with a chip called the 1103 that had 1,000 bits on it. Right? The chips you buy today have like 4 million bits, and the Japanese are making ones with 16 million and 64 million bits. So this is 1,000 bits on a chip. This is the best thing that ever happened, because all of a sudden everything changed. This is one of these predictions of Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore that completely changed the relationship of us to computing hardware. And the people who wanted to build a big time-sharing machine at PARC, including Chuck Thacker and Butler Lamson, immediately started building one out of this memory. And it was also the right kind of thing to build the Alto out of. But we still couldn't have a lot of it. This is 1972 that we're talking about. And so this notion that the bitmap display is something that we didn't invent. People had talked about it. There even were small versions of it. Television.
Well, each part of the screen.
Television is something that is discrete in one dimension and analog in another dimension, but you can think of it as being 300,000 separate pixels on a screen, and it's something everybody would like because it's perfectly general. The nicest thing about television is you don't have to determine beforehand what kind of picture you're going to show on it. You can show anything. You don't have to worry. Whereas every other kind of display, you had to have some notion about what you were going to display in order to know how much power you should build in a display. So we spent a year and a half or so trying different kinds of displays and making calculations and stuff. And at some point we realized, oh, heck with it. We just have to go for a bitmap display. And of course we didn't know that people would settle for tiny little displays like this. So the first display in the Alto actually was about 2.5 times the size of the first Mac. It was about 500,000 pixels, and it was an 8.5 by 11 page display, the exact size that the Dynabook was supposed to be.
And is it true you programmed the Cookie Monster? Is that true?
The Cookie Monster, the first, I invented the first painting program in the summer of 1972, and it was programmed up by Steve Purcell, who was one of our students. And again, the idea was to get away from having just crisp computer graphics as they had been in the past, because the idea is that people don't design on computers, and one of the reasons they don't design on computers is they can't make things messy enough. And my friend Nicholas Negroponte at MIT was also thinking similar thoughts. He wanted people to be able to sketch as well as to render. And so I invented the painting program. The painting program was a direct result of thinking seriously about bitmap displays. It's maybe the first thing you think of, because you are always painting on it. When you're putting up characters, you're painting characters. And it was very much like Mac Paint turned out to be many years later. I have a nice video showing it being used. And the second thing I thought up was that having a bitmap display would, combined with multiple windows like the Flex machine had, would automatically allow us to do this overlapping idea, which we all thought was terribly important, because we thought that this 8.5 by 11 display was impossibly small for all the stuff you'd want to put on, and the overlapping windows will give you a way of having much more effective screen space as you move things around.
Now this machine, the Alto, the prototype's produced in 1973. How does it compare in terms of what it's got compared with the Macintoshes and the machines we have now?
Well, I think the first thing is the Macintosh represents an amount of work, even to get the first Mac out, an amount of work equivalent to what we did at Xerox added on to it. So the screen design in the Macintosh is unique to the Macintosh and much nicer than we used. And I mean, there are all of these extra things on it. And of course, the number of tools you can buy, there's something like 9,000 pieces of software rendered in the Macintosh user interface that you can buy for it. So the scope is enormous. But in terms of the categories, it's about the same. We had both painting with bitmaps. We had crisp computer graphics. We did the first desktop publishing, the first WYSIWYG editors, and most of the paraphernalia that people work, with one exception, were part of the original concept of the software that went on the Alto, and that exception was spreadsheets.
Yeah. So one of the things that's quite interesting for an outsider, they see this mid-70s, most of the key ideas that we now regard as sort of intimate computing are there. Yet Xerox is not a computer company. What did you have hopes? What was your hopes when the Alto was built? Did you hope that that the world would see this product?
I for one oscillated between, because I thought of the Alto as just an intermediate stage. I wanted the Dynabook, and I thought of that user interface as a stopgap measure for the real thing, which is, see, I was basically interested not in the access literacy part, which the user interface represents, but in...
All right, sorry, we'll just cut a second. We'll just pick up on that question. Okay. You hope the world would... yeah?
Okay.
Yeah. Did you hope the world would get to see this? Because this was now no longer a general research
Well,
program.
one of the things that we realized early in the game with Xerox and its executives that we're going to have to do a lot of demonstrations, because we originally started out trying to talk to them, and we wrote a bunch of papers called the Pendry papers that expressed sort of what we were trying to do, and those did not get received into any worthwhile corners of their minds. So we thought that we would have to do demonstrations. So we were set up to do demonstrations. We did lots of demonstrations. Also, we didn't want to be cut off from the research community that we come from, so we wanted to be able to give demos. And the experience with Xerox went from where the lab being fairly open to periods of paranoia where the lab was completely closed to visitors. And we used to say to Xerox, look, we're years ahead of everybody else. Lead time is everything in this business. And you just carry through on the stuff. Don't worry, you can show everybody in the world this stuff. It doesn't matter, they won't be able to build it in time. It's still true. I mean, if you look at the Macintosh, which came out years later, look how long it's taken IBM to not quite get there yet. They're still pushing that idea, and Windows 3.0 has just come out. This stuff takes years to do. If you have a few years lead time on anybody and your people are capable, you can sustain it.
So Xerox could have had it all, and there might not be an Apple.
Well, I don't know about that because it's really hard to predict that kind of future. I was amazed at the number of people, for instance, who bought IBM PCs, considering how useless I thought they were. And the interest of everybody in switching over to the overlapping window interface with icons and mouse, I think, shows that what people bought millions of is not what they want. They want what we wanted early in the 70s. But I think predicting what people will do under conditions of expediency is impossible.
But in those days, right, there were just a few Altos. You couldn't buy them, right? There weren't that many, and Xerox didn't seem to have any immediate plans to sell them.
Well, we actually set up a production line for the things because as I say, I needed quite a few, and they started getting popular, and so we set up a production line, and I believe that upwards of 2,000 of them were built in the decade of the 70s. Certainly by 1975 or 76, almost everybody at PARC, including the secretaries, had Altos, and they were connected together by Ethernets, and there were page-a-second laser printers nearby that you could go to. So it was a very similar model to the offices that you see today. There were enough when Xerox made its fateful turn down in 1976. There were at least 500 machines operating the way machines do in the 1980s. So they were not turning down a paper idea or a single prototype. They were turning down something that had been functioning for 3 years.
And this was turning down an idea to sell a computer with a word processor as opposed to a...
Well, the story is complicated. It has to do with a bunch of things. I think the simplest way of characterizing what happened is that just as when IBM in the 50s turned down their chance at the Xerox machine because they ultimately thought they were in the computer business rather than the communications business, Xerox, when push came to shove, thought they were a copier company. So the problem with railroads, right, is they tried to make faster locomotives rather than investing in the airlines. And so there was that problem. There was a problem of slight more cost in doing the Alto versus a word processor that they wanted to do. All these things contributed. I think one of the main problems is that the executive who made the final decision had no way of personally evaluating what he was being told from different sides. So it was complicated. I mean, the best they could have. 1976, when they had to make the decision, you figure under best conditions it would take a couple of years to get a machine out. They would have had to charge around $20,000 or so for it, which is not bad that early because that's what word processors were selling for. But it was right on the edge. And by the time the Star came out, which was too little, too late, it was I guess a $20,000 machine that should have been sold for around $10,000. The Lisa had some of the same problem. It was a $10,000 machine that should have sold for a couple of thousand.
All right, if you can recollect where we were yesterday, we were talking about Xerox PARC. Do you look back on it as a sort of a golden age in computing, that so many people were gathered for a period together?
Well, I don't know, I sort of feel it would be a little bit presumptuous to declare it a golden age in computing. It was certainly a golden age for me. I think the 5 years between 71 and 76 were the most fun I've ever had doing research. And I think that there have been 5 or 6 critical places in computing over the last 40 years that have affected the way people think about things, and PARC was one of them.
Now, you weren't the run-of-the-mill Xerox executives, and Stuart Brand wrote an interesting article about you, didn't he?
Oh yes, well that was a hilarious little side excursion. Stuart Brand was the person who put the whole Earth catalog together, and he got interested in computer people because he lived right across the street from Engelbart's work at SRI, and so he decided he would do a piece about the culture. And one of the places that was just starting up then in 1971 and 72 was Xerox PARC. And so we all knew him, and he was a friend. We invited him in. He wrote this great article, which was published in the Rolling Stones, which was really considered to be a rag back then, especially by the East Coast establishment.
And this described you people sitting on beanbags and...
Yeah, so the whole culture, and the photographs were all taken by Annie Leibovitz, and it was a very Hollywood, California type scene, and the Xerox people did not like it at all, and they had an enormous reaction, so large a reaction to it that when Stuart republished the article in his book, they forced him to not use the name Xerox, and so he referred constantly in this article to Shy Corporation, which is what he called it.
Now you were talking yesterday about having done all this work on the Alto, the questions of whether you really wanted to get it out there and so forth, and you made lots of demos, you said. Now one in particular, big effort, was made at a sales meeting in Boca Raton, wasn't it?
Yes, that was rather late in the game, though. That was quite a few years after the Alto had been around, but there are constant recirclings of trying, and this wasn't so much trying to get the Alto out as a product, although there were people who were very interested in it. A lot of these meetings, particularly the Boca Raton one, had to do with just getting Xerox at the top and its major executives to have some sense of how the world was changing and what their future was likely to be.
Did you feel disappointed, not so much, as you say, that they might have had commercial reasons for not backing it, but did you feel that they really understood what you'd done, that they got it?
No, I don't think they got it, but I think the important thing about the Xerox deal is what they did promise to do was to give us relatively unsupervised support for a period of 10 years, and that is what they did. We had our skirmishes with them, and there were some people who had to sacrifice their body and soul to keep the umbrella over the group, but in fact Xerox turned out to be a very good funder, and there was no promise or even any intent that I ever heard in the beginning that Xerox was going to turn these into products. Most large corporations use their long-range research more as a hedge against future disaster than as pure product development.
So in a sense you weren't particularly surprised then that they...
Yeah, I was surprised. Sure, it's one thing for them not to make any representations about doing it as a product, but the whole setup was so obviously the way it was going to be that I was surprised, sure. I was amazed.
Now, while this has been going on, Ted Hoffman done the work on the microchip and so forth,
Yeah.
and hobbyist machines started to appear. What
Right.
did you guys make of the hobbyist machine?
Well, there was something that with first as a 4-bit wide chip and then an 8-bit chip and so forth, and they were sort of inevitable that they would appear. For me, I was surprised that so many people were interested in them. I realized that an enormous number of people felt disenfranchised from computers completely, and these were a way of getting in. I can touch the new technology and so forth, but the kinds of software you could run on them was really limited. And so there are various opinions at PARC. Larry Tesler was much more interested in the 8-bit machines than I was, as an example. My feeling was that you had to have at least a 16-bit machine that went so and so fast in order to do all of this stuff. And in fact, that's exactly the way it worked out. The Macintosh was a 16-bit machine that went thus and so fast, and you had to go that fast in order to do all the things that we were doing at PARC. And so from my standpoint, I would have just been just as happy if no machines had been built up until 1984 or so. Just from the standpoint of, you think of all of the unfortunate standards that were set, like MS-DOS and so forth, that are holding back the world even today. I think it would have been, but you never know.
Yeah, but on the other hand, as you say, they released this this pent-up sort of mass of disenfranchised people. I mean, that was what was surprising, even though, as you said, they were toys
Yes.
in one sense.
Yeah. And I think that, depending on how you look at it, certainly one great thing was done on an 8-bit micro, and that was VisiCalc. That was one of the best things that's ever been done on a personal computer as an idea. The reaction to that at PARC was both admiration and shock. We couldn't believe that we hadn't seen it. That's how arrogant we were. But I think that aside from that, almost everything else done on the 8-bit micros is sort of a reversion back to the early 60s when machines are very weak. Most of the 8-bit micros had either no operating system or terrible operating systems. It's not clear which is worse. And many of those operating systems are still hanging around today.
And what you saw happen after this work was done at PARC, we saw in the next years ahead, this was going to be exported from a company like Xerox, that wasn't really a computer company, into one of these new fledgling populist hobbyist companies, and that was a remarkable transition, wasn't it?
Yeah, I actually thought that Xerox was the right place to launch from, since it wasn't in the computer business. It really didn't have any history to give up there, whereas I think it was more remarkable for a company that was deeply wedded to a certain kind of 8-bit computing like Apple was, to be willing to throw it all out and start in a completely new way. But that is very much one of Steve Jobs' biggest strengths.
Do you have any recollections of the events leading up to Jobs' visit? Were you involved at all with that?
No, I was at the famous demo that Larry Tesler gave Steve Jobs and some of the other people from Apple. But
what had you heard? Had you heard that Xerox was interested in buying a stake in Apple? Was that known?
No, Xerox had a stake in Apple by then. There's a company called Xerox Development Corporation, and they had stakes in various companies. I forget how much it was, 10 or 20% or something like that. But I don't think, and of course we thought at PARC we thought the Apple was the better of the 8-bit micros that were around and so forth. But it was not unusual to have, we gave many demos, so it's not unusual to have somebody like Steve Jobs and other people come over.
Do you remember talking to Jobs that day? Do you have any recollection?
Sure.
And did he get it?
We got it right away. I mean, there are two kinds of demos. There are one where you're struggling to get the person to see what's going on. We found for many people we had to put they weren't used to looking at a computer screen, so we had to put our finger on the screen and get them to watch our finger and then see if they could focus in another quarter of an inch and stuff. And then there are other people who tell you what is going to happen next. I mean, they're so on top of the demo that they know, and now you're going to show me, yes, here it is. Those are great demos. I had the great pleasure of showing Smalltalk to Kristen Nygaard, who is the inventor of Simula, which is one of the major influences on Smalltalk, and it was that kind of demo. He just knew everything I was going to show him. It was stuff that he had been dreaming about for years, and and here it was, and we've been friends ever since.
Now, what do you think Steve Jobs' great achievement is then? I mean, because he took this, he got it, and he took it back.
Well, I think what he took back was an idea that things could be done a different way, and particularly Steve, who is such a visual person, very sensitive to how things look and appear and stuff, and the whole notion of the graphics interface was something that really captured his imagination. But and eventually some people from PARC went over to Apple. Larry Tesler was one of them. But what happened there was that they pretty much took what we had done as a departure point and did a completely new design. And I remember I didn't see any of it until the Lisa came out in 1983, and when I saw it, I thought it was just the best thing I'd ever seen. It was just incredible. The Lisa was beautiful.
1 second, what's that?
It's
a dog.
A little squeak.
No, it's a bird.
A bird?
Pause for a second. we're rolling again. Speed.
Great.
Okay. But the Lisa was still too expensive, and so really the Macintosh was the threshold machine, which really changed.
Yeah, and the Macintosh in many ways is not as good a design as the Lisa, but it was a severe compromise. And the thing that was great about it is that it used the weak power of the then 16-bit 68,000 to great advantage, where the Lisa couldn't quite make it with all the things it was trying to do. And so in many ways, you can think of the Macintosh 2 as the Apple's return to the Lisa.
Now, when the Macintosh came out, and certainly the history of the computer since then has been very much a sort of a vindication of everything you did at PARC, isn't it? In a sense, hadn't the main victory been won by that point? You know, people had realised computers at least could be different from they were.
I don't think any of us at PARC were fighting a war, so it wasn't clear who we were victorious against. But if it meant getting lots of people convinced, I don't think that it was one, because the majority of people who compute today still don't interact with a computer in that way. We're still, there's this big urgency for. Hang on one second, I can hear my Macintosh dinging it.
Yeah,
it needs paper.
Yeah.
Hang on.
So we'll start time.
Okay.
Okay.
Speed.
Turn over.
Okay.
Start time. Yeah. Yeah. So.
We can hear that. Just put the cat in the garage.
So you were saying that while it introduced a lot of people to this technique, it hadn't.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that what we did at PARC was not an ultimate answer to the problem of interacting with computers. So I think that a lot of people are going to be interested in it more than the millions that are now, and what will inevitably happen is that people will continue to be interested in long after it is worthwhile interacting with computers that way. So you have this thing where people have this tendency to, once they like something, they get religious about it, and then it hangs on long beyond its actual use.
Now, at the time the Macintosh came out, Apple essentially was betting the company on it, right? And there was this very popular standard MS-DOS in existence on millions of computers.
Right.
Talking a bit about why do you think, what are the reasons why most people find one more intuitive and easier than the other? And I want you to talk about some of the things you talked about yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we ultimately know, but
Let's start again.
Right. I don't think we ultimately know what the reasons are, but we certainly were guided by some theories that we have different ways of knowing about the world, and only one of them is through language. We have a kinesthetic way of knowing about the world through touch. We have a visual way of knowing about the world, and the kinesthetic and visual ways seem to be more intuitive for people. They're less crisp. They deal more with analogy, and the touch thing makes you feel at home. You're not isolated from things when you're in contact with them. You're grounded. And so I think that for me the major reason the Macintosh works is because the mouse gives you just the tiniest way of putting your hand in through the screen to touch the objects that you're working on. The screen gives you a theatrical representation of something much more complex, something that computer designers don't even want to think about as a computer executing 2 million instructions per second with thousands and thousands of instructions in there. And then finally, the least successful thing that we did that we're still working on is a symbolic underpinning for all of this that allows you to express back into this little pocket universe.
Right. But certainly the image, I mean, you have a film where you show a 2-year-old child. The image of the computer underwent quite a transformation.
Yeah, so I think so. That film of the little girl, 22 months old, using a Mac very confidently, she'd already been using it for about 6 months or so, strikes a lot of people in a way that words don't, because they see, here's this little child about 70% literate in the access part of the Macintosh user interface. She can start up applications and do things in them, save them away, and all of those things. And that's what we were trying to do, is to extend this thing from being something like a specialized tool or a car to something that's more like media that extends down into childhood and up through the elderly.
I want to turn a bit now to the practice of writing those interfaces and application software itself, and the some of these problems are differences between software and hardware. People, basically, how would you characterize the difference between software and hardware? Because the word software, as far as I can see, only grew up about 1960. I mean, it's not something. It was something new in a way.
That's true. Although the the notion of the stored program goes back a long way. But I think for me, there isn't any real difference. That hardware is just software that's crystallized early. Because basically, what you always have is something that you can remember in terms of some medium that can take on markings. And there are different kinds of markings, and then you have to have something that allows you to change those markings and read them and change them. And the simplest kind of computer you can build is one that only has a couple of states in it, and it's all memory. It's practically a clock, and everything is out on the memory, so there's almost no hardware there at all. And the main reason that there's a fair amount of bits in the hardware of today's computers is there are a lot of functions you'd like to compute rapidly, and so there are special purpose little pieces of logic in there for doing fast arithmetic and so forth.
And that sort of grew out of this historical accident that the first functions people wanted to compute were computational, so it made sense to put in a special circuit
to do arithmetic and stuff. Yeah, I think it definitely is true, and there have been computer designs and computers built that look at their memory in a completely different way of doing content addressed storage and having many thousands of processors looking at storage at the same time, where hardly anything resembling arithmetic is done most of the time. But in fact, it doesn't matter, because arithmetic itself is just a manifestation of a particular way of putting the logic elements together.
So at its very basic level, in the way like Turing might have thought about, this is the general purpose manipulator of symbols. What do you mean? It takes some markings, transforms them, and puts out other markings.
Right, and there's a trade-off between the number of different kinds of markings that you want to have the memory store and the amount of logic that you need to be able to carry out computing functions.
If we take a sort of average sort of computer, its hardware can carry out just about 100 basic functions.
Sometimes, yeah. These days, they're usually up in the range of 300 or so. I think for most people trying to understand how a computer works down inside, it's actually mostly memory. There's a vast amount of very undifferentiated stuff that is just for holding the markings. Then there's a very small amount of logic that carries out a few basic instructions. And you can think of all the rest of the hundreds of instructions as things that the basic instructions could carry out but have been encoded specially for speed.
And then what the program has to do is, using these available facilities, has to instruct it to do.
Yeah, well, most good programmers are relatively lazy, and so the last thing they want to do is spend a lot of time grubbing around down in the machine code of the computer. So usually what they do is they write a couple of pieces of software. One is called an operating system. Another one is called a programming language, and often they are both the same, as Smalltalk was. And what that piece of software does is to create a virtual machine, which is much more hospitable. And so it's the machine simulating a much nicer machine. And all of a sudden, life is much more fun. And often you'll use that machine to simulate an even nicer machine. Eventually things slow down so that the most wonderful machine you could have might run too slowly to be interesting, but some people still like to program in terms of these highly idealized machines because maybe they'll be built one of these days.
So in a sense, are you telling us that what we see on our Macintoshes is a much pleasanter machine?
Yes. And in fact, the user interface you can think of as the last layer that is designed to further sweeten the realities of all these different layerings that are going on. Most important thing is it's when you're doing when you're cooking a cake, baking a cake in the kitchen, you don't have to worry about the details of organic chemistry because they're already subsumed by the ingredients that you have, and the recipes are there to make sure that what you'll have converges on a cake rather than a mess. And for exactly the same reason, people like to confine where they're working into an area where they know what roughly is going to happen, and if that area doesn't work out well, then they'll go to a deeper level and make a few changes.
Now, all of this, of course, depends on the computer being able to carry out instructions fast. I mean,
Right.
Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be having this.
Simulation would not be that much fun if it were really slow. Right, as it was when they had to just calculate simple trajectories of shells in World War II. They'd have 300 or 400 people on desk calculators just calculating a simple ballistic trajectory. That was a simulation, and in wartime it was deemed important enough to put these 400 people to work for days doing these things.
Now, before the computer was built, Alan Turing, approaching the subject from a different point of view, spoke of a very simple machine which could
Right.
imitate all other machines. The digital computer is an example of one such sort of machine,
Right.
isn't it? And what does it mean then, in that sense, to call it a universal machine?
Well, I think it's one of the niftiest things to wrap your head around, and that is that regardless of what kind of thing you have, if it has a few basic properties like a memory and the ability to put symbols into memory and take them out and make changes and make a few tests on them, that is enough machinery to enable you to simulate any computer that has ever existed or any computer that will ever exist. How interesting the result will be depends on how fast the simulation runs. But in fact, people sometimes think that a little machine on a desk or even a sharp wizard calculator is a different kind of thing than a big cray computer. But in fact, they are the same kind of thing. You could calculate one of the greatest pieces of 3D graphics on a sharp wizard, given enough centuries to do it, and enough external memory to put parts of the calculation.
So this machine, even though it was built for mainly to do scientific calculations, some people realized right from the beginning it had just enormous potential.
Yes. In fact, the first person who seemed to realize it was Ada Augusta, who was the sidekick of Babbage and maybe history's first programmer. And she wrote in one of her papers that she said the analytical engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the Jacquard loom weaves patterns in silk. And she understood that the generality of representation was the same kind as you can represent in books, which is namely the kinds of things that we can talk about. It wasn't restricted to just numeric calculations, but it extended into the realm of general symbolization of models.
And this amazing capacity has a very seductive quality about it. And
it is to us.
Yeah. And
right.
I'm thinking of, say, in the late 50s at MIT, some of the early hackers, once people who realized the potential that they could make this machine do this, that, and the other, or Ivan Sutherland, or whatever you mentioned.
Yes.
It was like a...
Yeah, I think two things happened. The Turing thing was there, and most of the early computer people either were mathematicians or had a lot of math in their background. And there are other formulations like that of Turing. Gödel's theorem also was a way of building a universal machine, and there's a thing called post-production systems, which is a similar. They're all studying mathematical problems, but they translated well to computer machinery, and most computer people were aware of them. Then the second thing that had to happen was that there had to be some way of believing that the computer could get big enough and fast enough so that anything that Turing said made any practical sense. So you have to have both of those things. And what's happened is that very early on, even in the 60s, but especially in the 70s, people regularly would build very simple computers and then use those simple computers that ran very quickly to simulate the kind of hardware they really wanted. That's what we did at Xerox PARC. Chuck Thacker, who did the Alto, built a machine with almost no logic for that period of time. I mean, in 1972, it had about 160 chips, 2 boards worth of chips. So it was very, very few gates, but it ran extremely fast. And it ran about 5 times faster than its main memory. And because of that, the Alto could be many different machines. It was a Smalltalk machine when we ran Smalltalk on it. It was a Mesa machine when they ran Mesa on it. And it could take on different personalities. And I've always thought that that was a really good way to go until you actually know what the biblical truth is on what your computer architecture should be. Why not have a computer that you can mold into the kind of virtual machine that you want right at the lowest level?
And this tractability, this moldability, gives the computer a romanticism that other machines lack, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I agree on the romantic part, but of course I'm fairly romantic about musical instruments, so that most musicians are. Most musicians adore their instruments, and so I think that from my standpoint, my romance is very much connected to the same way I think about other marvelous contraptions that we've made, including musical instruments, but sailplanes, the kind of marvelous inventions that Paul McCready makes, and so forth.
But they don't have this capacity of building a private universe, do they?
No.
It's special.
No, with a musical instrument, you can build a private universe for somebody else. That is, you can make one, but it doesn't have the tangibility that the computer has. On the other hand, it's worthwhile remembering, though, that no matter what we build on the computer, no matter what appears on the screen, it doesn't have any particular sense to it unless some human is there comprehending it. So it does have something in common with building a beautiful piece of music. That there has to ultimately there's a listener. Might be just the composer, but what comes out has to in some way come back into the human sensorium and be understood.
Now you use a metaphor which is quite helpful in understanding programming of a puppet theatre. I wonder if you could give us that.
Yeah, I think I got talked into that by some magazine. One of the traditional ways of programming on a computer is to think of the memory part of it as being inert, like ingredients in a kitchen, and to think of the programs that you write as being like the recipes. And then the central processor is kind of like the cook who's looking at the recipe book and then goes over and stirs the ingredients, and if you're lucky you wind up with something good to eat. And another way of thinking about that is that's like a puppet theater, because the puppets are all inert and there are puppet masters going around. In the computer, it's a very energetic puppet master, because there's one generally goes around and twitching all of the strings of all of the puppets fast enough so that it seems like something real is going on. But another way of looking at programming is to say, well, why not let the puppets pull their own strings? So we'll let each puppet have, in effect, its own little computer within this larger computer, and we'll let them be much more self-contained. There won't be puppet masters from the outside, and that's called object-oriented programming. And the benefits of it are simplicity and ease of writing the programs.
So in procedural program, if I want to tell my puppet master what to do, I have to list everything absolutely in the right order. And in object-oriented, I build my objects, give them behavior, and let them...
Yeah, well, I think there's a continuum from totally lockstep proceduralism to trying to deal with multiple processes, to having objects which have many of their processes inside of them and act much less sequential and so forth, to what's coming in the future, which is we sometimes call agent-oriented programming or modular control programming, or hasn't got a good name yet, but of something where the elements are much more like biological cells, that they're quite self-contained. They may spend 90% of their energies just maintaining their own equilibrium, and maybe only 10% of them contributes to the larger system as a whole.
And these are presumably even higher levels of virtual machines that we're...
Yes, that's a very good way of thinking about them.
Now, just to get one point clear, every time we go further up to a high level of virtuality that suits us, it generally means the computer has to work even harder, does it?
Yeah, although I don't think the computer is only working at one level. Yeah, any given computer, it's always executing 2 million instructions per second. So you can't make it work harder. But it's like if you have a 5 horsepower go-kart and you put it up various grades of hills, there'll be a hill eventually that it won't be able to climb. It's always putting out 5 horsepower, and it needs 10 to get up that particular hill. And that's what happens. Things start slowing down as you put more and more burden on an old-style processor.
Give me an idea of what's going on if I'm looking at a screen and I want to do something like open a file on a Mac desktop. I mean, some notion of how many operations might be involved.
Well, you can figure it out because the typical Mac these days executes about 2 million instructions per second, and if it takes, well, let's say opening a file, it has to go out to the disk, so it's complicated because now it depends on the speed of the disk moving stuff back and forth. But suppose you're just in the multi-finder and you're in this window doing something, and you put the mouse in another window, and the window comes up to the top of the screen, and you can easily just get out a stopwatch. If it's a big lumbering thing and it takes about a second to rebuild the screen, then 2 million instructions have been executed. If it takes 2 seconds, then 4 million instructions have been executed. And it's always executing that many instructions per second, even when it's just idling.
So it's the most monumental complexity going on underneath these simple things.
Yeah, and often the complexity is something that is a byproduct of the way the system was programmed rather than being intrinsic.
I want to move on now. I'm going to move on to your current work at the school, but I want first you to talk a little bit about the idea of tools and agents historically and so forth.
Okay. Well, the way I think about tools and agents is need some sort of perspective to think about them, and I think about them in terms of the way we've extended ourselves over the last several 100,000 years. And when you say extension to somebody, they almost always come back and say tools. And indeed, there have been levers and wheels and physical tools, but there have also been mental tools like language and mathematics. And I think of tools as being extensions of the gesture, as a way of manipulating things. So you're manipulating symbols when you're dealing with language. You're bringing things that are hard to deal with into your power via your hand or something like your hand. So the M word to me for tools is manipulation. And tools are things that you watch while you manipulate them. And then the other main way people have extended themselves is by getting other people to take on their goals. Mumford called this making mega machines. He said that for most of human history, most machinery made by humans has had other humans as its moving parts. So we make cities and cultures, and there are groups trying to do this and groups trying to do that. And there are fewer goals in those kinds of groups than there are people. They've taken on each other's goals, traded off one way or another, and they are communicating. And the kind of entity that can take on your goals and act on your behalf we call an agent. So an agent is something that watches you and you manage it. So the M word is management for agent and manipulation for tools. And in the...
You're saying that agents have generally been people up to now, whereas tools have been...
Yeah, you could say that a shepherd dog or maybe a horse, maybe a thermostat is something you have to work fairly hard with to build a thermostat to get it to take on the goal of what temperature that you want. But by and large, they've been people up to now. And the interesting thing about computers, when you're building agents on them, is the agents don't have to be as smart as people, just like a thermostat does not have to be as smart as a person to be useful. The main thing you want it to do is to be able to take on some collection of goals and be able to deal with those goals while you're not around.
So an agent has to have some artificial intelligence in it.
Yeah, if you like to use that term. You could call it flexible competence and make it sound a little less loaded.
So how would this work? So you feel that the computers of the next 10, 20 years, in addition to having the sort of rich interfaces they have, will have personal agents?
Yeah. I mean, one of the ways I think about looking ahead into the future is to try and find analogies that might actually make some sense, and also to look for driving forces. So the one of the driving forces for the Park type user interface came out just from there being inexpensive integrated circuits around. Start getting a proliferation of computers that are inexpensive enough for people to buy, and all of a sudden the kinds of people who might want to use computers changes completely. And so all of a sudden you need a much easier to use user interface. There's a driving force now to do something, because it isn't just graduate students anymore. To me, the driving force for agents is pervasive networking, because the techniques used on the Macintosh don't work well when you're connected up to 1 trillion objects scattered all over the world. You need something looking for potential objects that will further your own goals, and you need that something to be looking 24 hours a day. So we think that what we'll have is 10, 15, 20 or more little agents, many of them not particularly intelligent, but able to flexibly take on a goal that we have. Like an example of one is an agent that goes out and finds you the newspaper you'd most like to read at breakfast every morning. So all night long it works. It can touch dozens of different news sources, the Associated Press, New York Times, and so forth, looking for things that are relevant to you. It can go to other sources for getting photographs and so forth. It can do the news gathering with a particular interest in the kinds of things that that you have been involved in. A headline could say new fighting in Afghanistan, or it might say your 3 o'clock meeting was canceled today, because news now could involve your own electronic mail. A sidebar might say your children slept well last night. And this is an interesting example of an agent, because it's one that was built about 10 years ago. It did not require a large amount of intelligence in order to work. Its major strength was its ability to work 24 hours a day while you weren't there, and with a limited ability of doing matching against what you said you wanted and what it thought you wanted. It could do a great deal of useful work for you.
There you go, yeah. So if we think of, there have been a number of revolutions in the history of computers so far, but we're thinking now, most people think of the computer as a standalone desktop object, right? Where do you see, tying this in with your Dynabook concept, what you've been saying about networking and agents, where do you see the next sort of thing taking?
Yeah, well, I think the way I think about that is these three very different ways of relating the human to the computer. One is this institutional way of the time-sharing mainframe. One is the desktop way where you control all the stuff. And then the third way is the intimate way, which is the Dynabook way, which is continuously connected into the worldwide informational network.
So
it's part.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, a Dynabook is sort of a figment of imagination. It was a holy grail that got us going. It was a cardboard model that allowed us to avoid having meetings about what we were trying to do. It was a lot of different things, but it was basically a service concept, not a box concept. So there are actually three physical renderings of the Dynabook we thought about. One was the notebook. One was something that went in your pocket that had a head-mounted display in glasses, as I had worked with Ivan Sutherland's head-mounted display in the 60s. And then one was Nicholas Negroponte's idea of the sensitive wristwatch, that in the 20 years future or so, when there's a network wherever there's an electric plug in the wall, then your user interface will follow you from room to room as you go. That everything has become pervasive. You don't need to carry a big computer or even a tiny computer around with you. So the whole idea behind the Dynabook was the kinds of service and your relationship to it, which should be intimate, casual, mundane. You should be able to aspire to the heights on it, just as you can when you learn English. You can aspire to the heights of Shakespeare but you're not forced to do what Shakespeare did every time you use the language. So it's this idea of having a nice connected ramp without lots of bumps and so forth in it. You know, as Seymour Papert likes to say, low threshold, no ceiling.
Yeah.
Okay, speed.
Okay. Now, given you have that concept of the future, your current work at the moment at the Open School here in
Mhm.
Los Angeles with children who may inherit such a model as a computer, what is the objective of this work at the moment?
Well, there are several. One is that Apple traditionally has been a company very interested in the educational process and helping children in schools. And so we do a lot of things in this school that have to do with thinking about how schooling might be in the future. Then specifically, one of the things that we do is a project that's been going on for about 4 years now to try and help find ways that will allow children to be able to write in the computer as fluently as they can now read using the Macintosh user interface. And what we do, since artificial intelligence is coming along, we're trying to find ways to both understand artificial intelligence and understand how to program it by putting together a set of tools that allow children to do the kind of artificial intelligence programming normally only done by adults.
Now, this is done through a rather ambitious simulation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we're trying to. When you think of adults try and simulate humans and so forth, humans are pretty tough. Nobody's done a simulation yet. I've always felt it would be a good idea to work our way up through the food chain and start off with fairly simple animals, see how they interact with the world. That's something that children are interested in. And so quite a few years ago, we got the idea that it would be really great if we could give children an environment where they could create ecologies to study animals and plants and then build those models into the computer and see if those models reflected what they thought they understood from the real world. So there's a constant comparison between the real world and the computer model. The school has torn up part of its playground to make a life lab, which has both animals and plants in it. The classrooms have animal cages and aquariums and so forth. And so there's a lot of real animals to study. And then we also have Macintoshes with a new system we've designed called Playground that tries to bring some of the techniques of artificial intelligence programming to 8, 9, and 10-year-olds right now.
Are you trying to achieve literacy, computer literacy in children? I mean, are you thinking about that?
Well, yeah, I've never, in one sense, I think so, in the sense that I've always wanted to close the loop, at least, with something that was like reading and something that was like writing. And right now, the something that's like reading is using the Macintosh user interface language to deal with 9 or 10,000 applications that are out there. That seems to work reasonably successfully right now. And the equivalent of writing should be something that allows children to aspire to the same kinds of things that are built on the Mac. Now, they may not sit down and do Aldus PageMaker or something like that, because that's something like a large play or something. But they should be able to see a continuity between what they're doing and these tools that adults make for them. We want to do something like what Dewey was talking about in the last century, which is he pointed out that in most of the ages of mankind, the games that children played were serious simulations of what the adults did. So the African child practicing with a spear, or the Eskimo child learning how to kill birds because he's eventually going to have to go and kill seals for food, is doing something that is content rich relative to the adult world. But the 20th century child dressed up in a nurse's suit and playing nursey with her doll has been cut off from the content part of that adult activity. Only the form is left. And so the kids are very disenfranchised from most things that are happening to adults. And one of the things that was noticed right away with computers is that when you put a child on a computer, they know they're doing the real thing. That they can see instinctively the continuity between it and the other things that are going, actually much better than adults do.
The computer, many people claim, is going to have a big role in saving American education and so forth. And this is a worrying thing, because you said yesterday that the computer was a meta medium, so it can be what we choose it to be.
Right.
So how would you like?
Yeah, well, I mean, the story I always tell is, imagine the parents were afraid that their children wouldn't make it in life unless they were musicians, and the state legislature said, well, okay, we'll put a piano in every classroom, but we don't have enough money to hire musicians, so we'll give the existing teachers 2-week refresher courses, and music doesn't get into the classroom. And I think we have a very similar problem when we want to think of the technology as being the magic ointment. Musicians will tell you the music is in the piano. If it were, we'd have to let it vote. So at best what we have is an amplifier, and often these things that could be amplifiers will turn people away. Pianos often turn people away from music rather than turn them towards it. So I think the most important thing is to have, for people who want healthy schools, is to have parental involvement, because down deep it's the value system that the children pick up about what's important in life, that they mainly get from their parents, that is going to condition what they do with their time. It's hard to learn things in school. There are lots of things going on. School, to me, is basically about a resource for finding out that various things existed that you didn't think existed. But as far as learning them, most of the learning, I think, is done outside of school. And what the child decides to do outside of school with his time is going to depend on the value system. Once you have that going really well, then it is fairly easy to use all kinds of technology, because then it will simply amplify out from this interest in getting stuff happening in here.
It's interesting that this medium should come along at a time when a previous important medium like writing, everyone is so concerned about literacy in the schools.
Yeah.
Do you see it as a solution or possibly a worse problem?
Well, I think that was one of McLuhan's tongue-in-cheek jokes, is that we've had all these great inventions like the book, and they've hardly affected education at all, because if you go into most schools in the Northern Hemisphere, you find 30 humans writing down what another human is saying, and that's what was going on in Oxford in the 12th century. So, where's the book in all of this? So I think that the kinds of social whirlpools that exist when you get different kinds of humans together, like teachers and children, are going to have a lot to do whether technology gets used at all. I think the most important aspects have to do with areas of control and other kinds of things which are theoretically outside the domain of education, but a lot of school is about controlling the kids.
Now, if we're looking into this future, some of the things that might be important, can we count on the hardware continuing to improve for another decade?
Yeah, we can definitely count on the hardware continuing to improve for another decade, and probably more. But I mean, just this is just extrapolation. The current kinds of hardware that we know how to build has a very stable outlook for the next 10 years.
What about key ingredients from software, from artificial intelligence? Do you think projects like the Psych project are going to be likely?
Well, Psych project is one of my favorite projects, partly because it's done by one of the smartest guys in the U.S. in computer science, and partly because it's one of the hardest projects that anybody is trying to do right now. There are not a lot of researchers working on what I would call really frontier, difficult projects, but this is one of them. And his success will be and is about turning up new ideas for representing things. Whether the system is actually able to turn into what its design goals say it is, which is a model of human common sense, I don't think is nearly as important as the wake that it's throwing up. When you get a smart guy working on something really hard and a bunch of people being ingenious about it, you're always going to get good things.
Why would it be important to incorporate common sense, representation of common sense in future computers?
Yeah, that's a good question, because common sense is frequently wrong. Scientific discoveries of the last 300 years have been against common sense. But whatever common sense is, it's a kind of an underlying fabric for getting between things that we know in much higher detail. So one way of thinking of it is there are little things that we're expert in are like islands, and then there's this ocean that we can paddle around in from island to island. There's a way to get from one island to another. And the problem with most expert systems up to now is that they're an island completely surrounded by a cliff. If you go anywhere off what it's good at, it just drops you completely. There's no way of paddling to the next thing. And I think as I said yesterday, somebody, Picasso, I think, said, art is not the truth, art is a lie that tells the truth. And common sense is not the truth, but it's a lie that provides a continuous fabric to work around in that we can then delve deeper into. Another thing about common sense that's kind of interesting is that it might be possible to use the computer to enlarge what we think of as common sense by giving us sensory contact with things that we've never been able to have sensory contact with before, like things that are a million times smaller than us. Because common sense, I think, has a lot to do with the sensory domain and reasoning from things that are on our scale. Science, in a very literal sense, is nonsense because it's outside of the sensory domain. Almost everything that happens in science is very far, this common sense says this is solid. Should hit here. Common sense says this is solid, but science says it isn't. Common sense says the sun is going to come up tomorrow morning, and science says no, the earth is turning. And yet we still say what time is sunrise tomorrow. So I think the importance of psych using common sense has a lot to do with that regardless of whether we're scientists or not, we have this one way of knowing the world, rightly or wrongly, that is very comprehensive and gives us sort of a universal way of weekly getting from one topic to another.
You've sort of known a lot of the people in artificial intelligence through your career.
Uh-huh.
What do you think the sort of main legacy of artificial intelligence is? I mean, do you think it's been very
well, I think, some of my favorite crazy people are AI people. AI in the 60s was once defined as all that stuff we don't know how to do yet. And to some extent, it's been a moving target. Things that were AI problems in the 50s and 60s are now taught as part of computer engineering courses. And but as far as the AI as something mimicking in a strong way human intelligence, we're very far away from it. And so it's a good goal. It gives you something to reach for. And I think for people in the field who have some biological motivation to their interest, it's a good goal because it has partly to do with understanding more how we do it, wonder if there are alternate ways to do it. Can you only do it the way we do it? At what level do we do it? Do we have to do it at the absolute neuronal level? Do we have to simulate every neuron in a human brain to get artificial intelligence, or is there a higher level that we can do it? And those are good questions to ask, because if you look at the way, for instance, biochemistry is done by nature, it is appallingly inefficient. Very low energy transfer, the absence of some watcher from the outside seeing, oh yeah, it'd be much simpler to do it this way. So, for instance, the way we do chemistry in a lab and the way nature does biochemistry is completely different. We do it much more efficiently. Nature does it much more ingeniously because of the way it's contrived. And you can learn a lot from looking at the comparison between the two. And so there's a lot of reason to expect that you don't have to go to the neuronal level to be able to do the kinds of things that we do. But nobody knows what level you actually have to go to.
Right. Now, you mentioned just earlier that you worked with Ivan Sutherland on the head-up display.
Mm-hmm.
One group of people argue that the stage we've got to with the human-computer interface is 2D, 2.5D is just a sort of a stepping stone. That beyond that there is this virtual reality. What's your view on that?
Well, I think people, many people will enjoy virtual reality since many people don't enjoy the current reality. Television is a kind of a virtual reality, and I think things that go further in that direction will be very popular with a lot of people. I think the best thing about virtual reality is that you can deal with these things outside of the normal senses. You can take a trip down into a cell and see how incredibly agitated the thermal properties are down there. I think all the things that you only can read about now in terms of symbols, you can actually go there and get a much more kinesthetic and visual hit on doing those things. I think the use of it in fantasy will certainly happen, but if you look at what you actually have to do to get good dramatic situations in the theater, then it's going to be a while before something good can happen in a movie that's partly being generated by your presence. On the other hand, if you look at a typical Arnold Schwarzenegger shoot 'em up, then those will be easy to do, right? Because so I forget what is the name of that movie. I can't remember the name of that movie that he just Total Recall. Total Recall. Somebody said if you like road accidents, you'll love this picture. And that kind of stuff, where you have 5 people you have to kill every 30 seconds or so, is very easy to set up in virtual reality. I'm sure that a large percentage of the population will enjoy it. Do a computer simulation that kids can understand from that one.
Were you running? Yeah.
Okay, speak.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, clearly the fact that you can make real thought experiments, so you could, many of the classic sort of thought experiments of Einstein and Bohr, you could do, right?
Yeah. And of course you have to be careful because simulations are lies in a sense, then there is nothing that says the simulation has to be like real life. I mean, there have been plenty of thought experiments that are wrong, and most of the great scientists have been good guessers. And so you can also set up simulations of situations that don't have anything to do with the physical world.
Right.
So you can delude yourself as well as help yourself along.
And you think that may be one of the dangers we...
No, I don't think that's a danger. I think that anytime people try and make models, try and look at their beliefs from different points of view rather than just one point of view, I think is good.
If we look back, I know you've thought a lot about the problems of predicting what's going to happen. If we look back at the history of the computer, it seems that almost everybody's been quite seriously wrong at every stage, with very few exceptions.
Yeah.
What lessons can we learn, if any?
Well, I think prediction, there are lots of different ways of doing prediction, but the worst one in the 20th century has been extrapolation. So just because something is X and 10% in some other direction of X gets you here and so forth doesn't mean a thing. It's like if a computer could do so-and-so, it would have to be the size of the Empire State Building. Well, that was when people's imaginations were limited by vacuum tubes. So the extrapolative way, I think, is out. But the reason the predictions that we made in the late 60s were so good, and the reason Bush's predictions in the 40s were so good, had to do with a completely different way of predicting, which had to do with thinking about things that amplify human endeavor. And the amount of horsepower available that is interested in making human endeavor be amplified is very, very large. So if you can hook into something like saying, if you can say, oh, the computer is a medium, then all of a sudden you start seeing what the powers of amplification are, and you also start getting ideas about what to do next. You look at, say, Freud's model of human mentality, which is a good one, but it's all about drives. That doesn't help you much in doing a user interface. You look at Brunner's mental model, which is about different ways we have of knowing the world, and all of a sudden you get ideas.
It's interesting, isn't it, that one of the arguments which said there'd never be many computers was the one that we'd never be able to find enough things for them to do.
Yes. And that's another one of those things is again, it was looking at the kinds of things that computers are doing now, and as people used to say, that's right, you numbskull, but it's all the new things that they can do. It's not we can do payroll on the mainframe when the personal computer came along. It's all those things we can't do on the mainframe, like spreadsheets and desktop publishing and so forth.
Well, you see the future of the computer as becoming totally unremarkable.
Well, I would hope so. Nowadays, 10 years ago, if you went into somebody's office and you didn't see a phone, that would have been remarkable. It was the absence of the thing that would have been remarkable. Nowadays, if you go into somebody's office and you don't see a phone, you assume they're wearing one. But you do not assume that there is no phone in a person's office, because it's something that's noticeable when it's absent. And the computer right now is still more noticeable by its presence than its absence. When you go somewhere and somebody doesn't have a computer on them, and that becomes a remarkable thing, then I think the computer will have made it. Its destiny is to disappear into our lives, like all of our really important technology. The things that we don't think of as technology, like wristwatches and paper and pencil and clothing and all of those things. I think the computer's destiny is to be one of those.
And it will disappear into our lives, embodying all previous media, or many previous media, as it goes?
I think so. I think we have to be careful because when you simulate one thing by another, you usually give up something. And anybody who's ever seen the Book of Kells for real realizes what you don't get from photographs, realizes what you don't get from printed books, and also realizes what you do get from printed books, that the compelling charisma, the transcription of the oral event that was a book like the Book of Kells is completely different from the alienating regularity of machine type. And both of those things have their place in the world. You would hate to get rid of one completely and say, well, we're replacing it with the new, because I don't think it works that way. I mean, I'm building a rather large Baroque pipe organ, even though you can, quote-unquote, simulate them on synthesizers and stuff today. And the answer is you can't simulate them. You can't get all of the stuff yet. And even if you could prove beyond a shadow of doubt that the waveforms from it, you still don't get something that looks as neat. And so I think if you include all of our senses into an experience, that when you simulate something, as you always do in science, what you're saying is, I'm going to give up this in order to get that, and that's my trade-off right now. But a person who says, I'm going to use this and I'm not going to give up any of that stuff is just fooling themselves, because there isn't a complete interconvertibility between one medium and another.
That's a tricky question really at the end. I mean, how would you rate the computer? I mean, you've studied a lot of human history. I mean, is this something we've been privileged to live through? Is this really a very remarkable development?
Well, I don't think it... And I think one way of rating the computer is to say it's definitely a thing like the printed book. It is definitely in an unremarkable stage, like 30 years after Gutenberg. And almost certainly, if its promise is realized and it's not just turned into television, because that's one of the things it can simulate as well. But if it can deal with all of the range of things it can deal with, and people use it to express all of those things, then it very likely will have the same kind of effect on our civilization as the printed book did. Whether it has that effect on any given person, though, is a completely different question, because as people have noted, the Renaissance has come and gone, and we have what we are pleased to call civilization now, and a large percentage of the population, not just in third world countries, but in our own country, have never touched the 20th century as far as its ideas are concerned. And in spite of all the libraries with all the books and all the things and what books have done to us, a very large percentage of people have never been carried along with them. And that is very likely to happen with the computer.
So we haven't really succeeded with the last major medium.
Yeah, I doubt it's probably the case that we never succeed with those things. That civilization gets transformed, and a certain critical mass of people get transformed by it, and they are the ones who transform the civilization. And then, for one reason or another, a large number of people don't get transformed by it. But another way of thinking about it is, if you take a look at what the average person who has not been transformed by it but who's gone to college today thinks about the world, it is a little bit better, a little bit richer, I think, than what people thought about the world in 1000 AD.
Now, there's a problem with this literacy thing you said, because I know you think of television as like a medieval stained glass window in some ways. Yeah. That actually you don't need to learn anything to do it. Is that the point? Rather like.
Well, you have to learn something, because we know that when D.W. Griffith first invented close-ups and moving cameras and montages and stuff, that the audience was a little bit startled, but it didn't take long. Once one passed through it, and they got the idea of what was going on, and so the the amount of learning in the visual domain is pretty low compared to what you have to do in doing reading and writing, and that is a big barrier. The biggest problem, though, I think, is that many people believe that there is an equilibrium between the two media, that what you can say in a book you can say on television, and all of the evidence is against that. That what you can do with television are some very important things. You can get people interested, you can give them an emotional hit, you can get them to know somebody in a way they didn't think they could do it before. You can maybe get them to be interested enough to look deeper, but its very strength is its weakness. Its strength is its involvement. Its weakness is its involvement. Because in order to think scientifically about the world, you have to be romantic. It's true, but you also have to be able to step back and say, gee, I wonder what else it is. It looks this way, but I wonder what else it is. I wonder what else is going on. And I don't think television gets people to do that kind of connected thought away from the dominance of the senses.
There's also a thing you write about called the amplitude problem. There's a thing that some media require more concentration than others, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
And written media do, right? And some forms of television and some forms of games and so forth don't. The question is, will the computer disappear into the television or the other?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it requires more concentration, but it may very well be that, some people read well, and it's nothing for them to read a book a day. And other people, this is a big deal. I mean, it's a struggle, and what's likely is going on is that most people never learn to read very well. And so the amount of concentration they have to put into the mechanics is what defeats them with the amount of material that has to be read. And I think it's much more like that, because it's remarkable how much concentration you have to put into something like tennis until you learn to play it, or how much concentration you have to put into music on the mechanics until you actually get fluent at playing. But then the hour, once you've gotten to that place, and the hours go by without even realizing, because you're deep into what the content of the medium is.
Last question is, what surprised you most about the history of computing?
What surprised me most? Well, I think the thing that surprised me the most is how long it has taken to get ideas out of laboratories into the commercial world, of how many different kinds of inertia there are, both for good reason and for bad reason, but just the sheer amount of time where a decade after an idea is a very short period to see it emerging in the commercial world. That is certainly surprising to me, because most of the scientists who work on these things work on them because they were obvious. They're so obvious that they just want to make them. And to have them not be obvious, and to have them something that was revolutionarily obvious, to have it go through an evolutionary stage that may take 10 or 20 years is quite surprising.
Do you think there's any way of cutting down that period?
I don't see it right now, because I think it's I think it's a question of having people grow up being interested in multiple points of view rather than being disturbed when they're shown something outside of their single way of looking at the world. And our civilization is very prone towards single-minded ways of looking at the world. We come from a monotheistic religious background, which says there's a right and a wrong, and you're either for God or against God, and so forth. And these attitudes trickle over into our reactions to everything. If we're doing what we're doing now is right, then something that's different from it can't possibly be right. The Japanese seem to be a little more flexible. In some of those scores, they have several religions existing side by side in Japan, and many of the people adhere to several of them at once. They don't see any big conflict. And I think any civilization that can treat ideas as interesting, as more interesting in an array than as treated singly, is going to make it into the future.